Number 11, Welham Square, by Herbert Stephen. We were sitting in the drawing room of our house at Bayswater one evening after dinner, in high good humour. I had that day been appointed to a certain post at the British Museum, which would afford me ample opportunity for the studies in which I was most interested, and put me in possession of what I expected to find an ample competence. We had been talking over my prospects, and the only cloud I could discern upon the horizon was that I should have to be at my post at an earlier hour in the morning than was comfortably compatible with the 3-mile walk from our house to the museum. "What a pity," said my younger sister Patricia, "that we don't still live in the dear old house in Welham Square. You could have got to the museum from there in 5 minutes. I was born after we left Welham Square, but Patricia was 6 years my senior and could remember her nursery days there. "Not at all," said my father very abruptly. "The walk will do you all the good in the world." As the old gentleman had been, to all appearance, fast asleep for at least 10 minutes, I was rather surprised at the energy with which he spoke. Looking up, I saw my mother making anxious signals to Patricia, which she followed up by instantly changing the subject. A few days afterwards, as I descended reluctantly into the bowels of the earth at Edgware Road Metropolitan Station on the way to my new work for the first time, this episode recurred to my mind, and I began to speculate upon what might be the reasons that made the mention of Welham Square distasteful to my parents. I determined to consult my eldest sister Ellen on the subject, and from her, and some other sources, I gradually accumulated the facts, which I will present here in the form of a continuous narrative. Number 11 Welham Square has always been the freehold property of my family. It was built, together with several adjoining houses, about the beginning of the 18th century by the owner of a plot of land in which the houses stand, a retired attorney who had 2 nephews. These were Andrew Maisie, my great-great-great-grandfather, and his cousin Ronald Maisie. Ronald, who was generally thought to be his uncle's favourite and probable heir, was an exceedingly tall and powerful young man, with a forbidding and melancholy expression of countenance. As a boy, he was singularly backward, and his incapacity for mental exertion seemed to develop, as he grew up, into something not far removed from downright idiocy. His weakness of mind caused him to be remarkably subject to the influence of those with whom he lived, and in particular his cousin Andrew, my ancestor, was supposed to exercise over him an influence almost amounting to fascination, and to be able to mould him to all the purposes of an exceptionally vigorous will. Shortly after the building of the houses in what is now Welham Square, the uncle of these 2 men died, and Andrew took possession of all his property under the provisions, as he asserted, of a will, the existence of which no one except Ronald had any interest in disputing, and which no one except Andrew, the sole executor and devisee, ever saw. Shortly before his uncle's death, Ronald had become engaged to a young lady named Lettice White, to whom he was passionately attached, and it was generally supposed among the neighbours that upon his accession to the avuncular wealth the marriage would take place. But when a barely decent interval had occurred since the old gentleman's obsequies, the fair Lettice was led to the altar, not by the impecunious Ronald, but by his more fortunate cousin Andrew. The newly married pair took up their residence in number 11, and Ronald came to live with them. When it was represented to Andrew by some of his few intimate acquaintances that his arrangement was so singular as almost to be thought improper, he curtly gave them to understand that Ronald's mental condition was not such as to permit of his only living relation allowing him to live alone, and that he was compelled by the merest considerations of family affection to take the unfortunate young man into his own household. So the 3 lived on in the stately and somewhat gaunt mansion, Andrew collecting his rents with methodical regularity, and otherwise giving his neighbours but little concern. As for Ronald, there soon came to be little doubt in anyone's mind of his confirmed imbecility. He appeared seldom, and when he did, was for the most part silent, regarding his cousin and former betrothed with an expression of the profoundest submission, which at times merged into a look of wild and hardly human apprehension, like a terrified brute beast, as it was put by an old lady who was one of the few friends occasionally privileged to partake of the gloomy hospitality of this uncomfortable establishment. Nothing more was ever known of the condition in which my ancestor, his wife, and his cousin lived, and no one was specially interested when, about 6 years after the marriage, Ronald, who had not been seen for many months, died, and was buried in a frugal manner. Before he had been dead a year, Andrew and Lettice suddenly left their house and took up their abode elsewhere, and after a while a tenant was found for number 11. 30 years later, the lease of the house having expired, Andrew's son, who had succeeded to his father's property, came to reside there, but not for long. He left the house suddenly after a few years, and a rumour went abroad that it was haunted, probably by the ghost of the unfortunate Ronald. From this time, number 11 descended from father to son, the adjoining property being sold piecemeal as the family necessities dictated. Occasionally, the successive freeholders made attempts to live there, but they never stayed more than a few months, and on each occasion of their removal, the rumours of ghostly possession were renewed. These, however, would die away, and tenants would, after a time, be found who never suffered from any inconvenience. The last occupation by the owner was that of my father, who moved into the house when my sister Patricia was a little girl. After living there a year, he left precipitously, but Ellen could give me no particulars of his reasons for doing so, and knew only that he disliked any reference to the house, and never mentioned it himself. The house was now let to a stockbroker with a family. 2. 5 years had elapsed since the conversation I related at the beginning of the previous chapter. My parents had both died, and Patricia was married and living with her husband in a provincial town. My career at the museum had been a prosperous one, and I was now entrusted with a more responsible and better paid office. The tenant of number 11 Welland Square had just given me notice of his intention to depart from it, and it occurred to me that it would be interesting to follow what seemed to be the family destiny, and try living in the house myself, to say nothing of the fact that it was admirably suited to my requirements. I felt fully capable of confronting any number of ghosts, and my wife was neither timid nor superstitious. Accordingly, at the beginning of the new year, we established ourselves with our 2 babies, and my sister Ellen, who lived with us in Welland Square, greatly delighted with the proximity of my work, with the solid masonry, spacious apartments and roomy passages of our new abode, and with the remnants of 18th century fashion and grandeur which seemed to pervade the neighbourhood. And in Welland Square we lived prosperously, without any kind of disturbance, for upwards of 6 months. In the course of July, my wife and the children left home to spend a couple of months at the seaside. I intended to join them when the time came to take my holiday, and in the meantime I stayed in London, going daily to my work. Ellen stayed on with me to keep house in the absence of her sister-in-law. One evening, 4 or 5 days after my wife's departure, I was sitting in my study, a large room with a door leading into the drawing room, and a heavy curtain hung over my side of the door. It was past 11. My sister had retired half an hour before, and the 2 maids who were left in the house were presumably in bed and asleep. I was therefore surprised to hear heavy and somewhat slow footsteps, apparently those of a large man, ascending the stairs on the ground floor. The front door, I knew, was locked and chained, nor had I heard anyone ring. The steps paused for a moment on the landing outside my door, and then I heard the intruder proceed to go up the next flight of stairs leading to the bedrooms on the second floor. I sprang up, seized a candle, and opened the door. As I stood on the threshold of my room, I seemed to hear footsteps, as of a man heavily mounting the stairs at the top of the flight leading up from my door. But though I held the light above my head, I could see no one. Everything wore its usual aspect. I walked quickly up the stairs, but nobody was visible. I searched all the empty rooms, but with no result. I called up Ellen and the maids, but none of them had seen or heard anything. I am ashamed to say that I made a specially rigorous investigation of a large room at the back of the house, which we used for a night nursery, and which, tradition declared, to have been the abode of my ill-fated kinsman, Ronald Maisie. I then went downstairs and completed my search of the entire premises. Everything was in order, and at the end of an hour I went back to my study and my book, rather annoyed with myself for having spent so much time in so fruitless an exploration, and determined to think nothing more about the matter. It was the next night after this that I suddenly started up very wide awake with a conviction that somebody was in my bedroom. I seemed to hear, still ringing in my ears, the sound of a long-drawn human sigh. I sat up, trembling with excitement, and looked about in the dim twilight of dawn in late July. I could see no one, but I did not feel alone. The feeling of suspense became unbearable. I jumped out of bed and walked with nervous determination to the window, where I turned round and faced the room, such light as there was being behind me. I saw no one. Again I walked across the room, and as I did so, I felt unmistakably that wave of air that meets one walking in the street when someone on foot passes close to him in the opposite direction. I seemed to feel the light graze of a passing substance against my nightgown. I was dimly conscious of a faint, indescribable odour, calling up recollections of a life long but indefinably past. And while I stood fixed to the spot with surprise and horror, my heart beating violently, I heard distinctly 4 long, heavy steps passing from me towards the window. The floor creaked under their weight. The next instant I felt that I was alone, but it was not until long after the morning was as light as noon that I fell asleep again. I woke much troubled in mind and doubting whether I should not, like my fathers, be compelled to leave this uncanny dwelling. But when in some measure restored by breakfast, I determined to say nothing to my sister at present, but to wait and see whether the situation would in any way develop itself. My resolution was fated to be put to the test sooner than I expected. I did not get home that evening until close upon dinner time. When I entered the drawing room, Ellen greeted me with, "Oh, Edward, what do you think has happened? Sykes is dead." Now, Sykes was a grey parrot belonging to my wife. He was so called because when he first came to us, it was affirmed of him, perhaps rather libelously, that like the hero of Mr. Calverley's poem, he habitually swore. He certainly did from time to time blaspheme somewhat unreservedly. I was secretly not altogether sorry to hear of his demise, so I answered with much composure, "Did the cat eat him?" "No," said Ellen. "He died in the most horrible convulsions." I went up to get ready for dinner, thinking more of how to prevent my wife from replacing Sykes by another clamorous bird than of the manner of the lost one's death. But in the course of our meal, it occurred to me that his fate was an odd one. "How did Sykes come to have convulsions?" I asked. "Why, it was most curious," answered Ellen. "I was going to tell you about it. I was in the drawing room writing letters, and suddenly I heard a tremendous screaming and flapping, and I looked up, and there was Sykes turning over and over in the air and pecking and clawing and flapping his wings and screaming, and before I could get to him, he suddenly twisted his head right round 2 or 3 times and tumbled down dead to the floor." "But do you mean," I said, "that he was carrying on these gymnastics up in the air?" "Yes. When I saw him, he was quite up above his cage, which was on the little table, and in his struggles he must have wrung his own neck." "That seemed rather remarkable." "Yes, and another remarkable thing was that he must have opened the door of his cage and got out all by himself, which I'd never heard of his doing before. because I had been feeding him with cake after lunch, and I know that the door was fastened then. I found it open when he was dead. Had he been out long? No, he must have been seized almost directly he got out, because it so happened that about 5 minutes before he began to scream, I fancied I heard the door open, and looked up to see if anyone was coming in, and no one was there, but I happened to see the parrot, and he was in his cage, just as usual. Well, I said, I suppose he's dead, and there's an end of it, but this is a very singular catastrophe. I hope Marion won't be inconsolable. During the rest of dinner, I was conscious of being rather poor company. Following close upon the mysterious occurrences I had described, Sykes's unhappy fate troubled me. My suspicions were, however, so undefined, and seemed even to me, when I tried to contemplate them from an impartial point of view, so ridiculous, that I could not bring myself to communicate them to Ellen, and incur the contempt which would be the deserved portion of a grown-up man who confessed to being seriously disturbed by an odd sound in an empty house, and by a commonplace nightmare. I have no hesitation in revealing these sentiments now that subsequent events have justified them, but that evening I again determined to wait. I did not have to wait long. It was a cold evening, and after bidding good night to my sister, I lighted a fire in my study and sat down to enjoy a new novel I had long been wishing to read. I was about halfway through my volume when I suddenly felt a sensation of cold. I looked up. The fire was burning brightly, but I did not feel its warmth. It was as though some opaque body or a large glass screen had been interposed between me and it. A moment afterwards, I felt the heat fall upon my face again. Had I heard the muffled sound of a footstep on the hearthrug close to me? I put out my hand and felt nothing but the warmth of the fire. As I gazed about the room in surprise, my eye fell on an armchair standing on the other side of the fire. It was a nearly new chair which I had bought shortly after coming to Welham Square. It had a leather seat, smooth and unworn, with particularly good and yielding springs. Hung upon its back was an antimacassar, worked aesthetically in crewels. As I looked at this chair, it struck me that the seat was considerably depressed, as though someone had recently sat down upon it, and the seat had failed to resume its ordinary level. This surprised me, for I had sat in the chair that morning and felt sure the springs then had been in good order. I looked at the antimacassar. Towards the top, it was pushed up in wrinkles. As I looked, it occurred to me that it was impossible for it to hang in such a manner by itself. It looked for all the world as if an invisible but substantial human frame was then actually sitting in the chair. When this notion occurred to me, I sat dazed with an indescribable horror, staring stupidly at the chair, which did not move. In an access of frenzied terror, I hurled the book I was reading at the chair. Did it strike the seat, or did it glance away a few inches from the edge and fall on the hearthrug? The next instant, the seat of the chair rose up audibly to its normal level, and the antimacassar fell out into its usual folds, still preserving, however, the traces of its previous wrinkles. I started up and, rushing to the chair, began to prod it. I could discover nothing unusual in its condition. As I was doing so, I felt a hand, beyond all doubt, laid steadily on my shoulder. I faced around and saw nothing. "Who are you?" I shouted. "What do you want?" But no answer came. I was alone. I sat cogitating till 1 o'clock, and then I went to bed. Just as I was getting into bed, it occurred to me that perhaps I might be annoyed in the dark, and though I had not yet seen anything, the prospect seemed rather awful, and with a slightly trembling hand I lighted a nightlight. When I had done so and got into bed, I was rather disposed to be ashamed of myself, and thought I would put it out, but partly, no doubt, from a disinclination to get out of bed, I determined that in any case it would do no harm, and that I would leave it as it was. It occurred to me what an odd thing it is that one feels safer in bed than anywhere else, whereas, in fact, one is never in a more defenseless situation. Then I went to sleep. I do not know what time I woke. It seemed to me that the air was blowing in upon my chest, where the bedclothes should have covered me up, and yes, certainly, there was a cold depression on my pillow, close in front of my face, as if some heavy weight were pressing it down. I put up my hand to investigate. I touched something on the pillow. I caught hold of it and turned cold with terror, for I held tightly in my hand another hand, neither cold nor warm, but large and solid. My light was still burning, and there was no one to be seen. The hand was suddenly jerked away from me. I sprang out of bed and rushed to the fireplace with a despairing feeling that someone followed close behind me. I seized the poker, turned round and struck wildly at the air. Whether I hit anything or not, I do not know. I remember only that as I was recovering myself from a frantic lunge at nothing, I received a sharp and stunning blow on the back of my head. When I came to myself, it was 6 a.m, and I was lying on the floor where I had fallen. The night light was out, and the morning sunlight was streaming in at my window. There was a very large and painful bruise where I had been struck. 3. I felt that this was getting beyond a joke. It was all very well to frighten me, but when my ghostly enemy took to knocking me down like a 9-pin, I was not going to keep it to myself any longer. I had no intention of surrendering, for the blood of the Maisies was up, and the fact that each of my ancestors since the house was built had sooner or later evacuated the premises made me all the more determined not to be driven away without making some further resistance. So I revealed to my sister Ellen the whole of my experience in the matter. She was decidedly sceptical about the ghost, if ghost it could be called, and suggested that I was not well. I vowed that I was as well as any man with a great hole in the back of his head could be, and she consented to the arrangement that I proposed, that she should sit up for a night or two in the drawing room while I was in my study with the door open between us, and that if any remarkable incident occurred, I should call her in. In order not to be wholly without male assistance in case I should be attacked, I invited a college friend of mine named Prescott, a strong, sensible and energetic young doctor who lived near us, to keep my sister company in the drawing room. He, when he heard my story, was, as befitted a scientific young professional man, exceedingly facetious at my expense, but he willingly consented to share our watch and to sleep in the house. That evening I sat up as usual in my study, while Prescott and Ellen beguiled the hours in the drawing room with light literature until about 2:30, when, nothing having occurred, we settled to go to bed and separated. Prescott, divided between high spirits at the temporary triumph of incredulity and a tinge of disappointment at the non-occurrence of anything in the shape of a row, and Ellen rather indignant with me for having kept her up so long to no purpose. After the stormy experiences of the 2 preceding nights, I thoroughly enjoyed an unbroken sleep. I prevailed upon my sister and my friends to give the ghost one more chance, and the next evening saw us again comfortably established in the 2 rooms, separated only by the curtain which hung over the door of communication. It may have been 11 o'clock when I heard a board creak just behind my chair. Uttering a shout, I sprang up and dashed at the spot from which the noise had come. I came into heavy contact with what felt like a gigantic human figure. Prescott and Ellen hurried into the room and beheld me wildly grappling, apparently with nothing at all. "By Jove," said Prescott, "he's got them." Them, I believe, meant some kind of hallucinations, upon which Prescott professed to be an authority, but I was struggling furiously with my unseen antagonist, and had no breath for explanations. "Seize him! Seize him!" I cried. At that moment, my prey burst from me, hurling me with prodigious violence across the room. Prescott rushed forward, and as he did so was tripped up by what he afterwards described as a heavy kick from an unseen foot and sent sprawling on the floor. Fortunately, I was prostrate at the other end of the room and could not be suspected of having had a hand or foot in this outrage. As we struggled to our feet, while Ellen stared wildly about, we all heard 2 or 3 hurried steps, as of a man running. There was a tremendous crash, and all was still. But the curtains had swung violently back into the window, and the window itself, plate glass, frame and all, was burst clean away outwards. Prescott was white as a sheet, and the sensible and strong-minded Ellen was actually crying, which impressed me more than anything else in the scene. "Let us leave this horrible house," she said. "Something worse will happen if we stay." But I was filled with an unreasonable kind of courage at having, as it seemed, put our inexplicable visitor to flight, and I was, besides, conscious of a certain degree of pride in the assurance that Prescott had been converted and would hardly talk again about my having got them. "We can't go tonight," I said, "and as our gentleman seems to have taken himself off for the present, we had better consider what's to be done next. I'm sure Prescott wants to stay and investigate the phenomenon." We shut the shutters over the wreck of the window and sat talking over the event until late at night. By degrees, I contrived to infuse into my companions some of my courage, and at last, no further disturbance having taken place, we all went to bed in pretty good spirits. I placed a loaded double-barreled pistol on the table by my bedside, thinking that if a ghost could be struggled with, he ought to be able to be shot, and Prescott placed within reach a large bowie knife, which he had brought back from America, and had long been wishing for any opportunity to make use of it. When I woke, I thought my last hour had come. My throat was tightly grasped by 2 extremely strong hands. A crushing weight was on my chest. I tried to shout, but could not. I was rapidly being strangled, and as I lay writhing, my eyes, forced half out of their sockets, glared through the light of the nightlight at the opposite wall, which looked precisely as usual, except that, as the squeezing of my throat grew more and more intolerable, my view of the room slowly darkened. But of the horrible and only too palpable form that was killing me, I could see no trace. In unavailing despair, I clutched at the iron wrists that held me down. In another moment, I believe, I should have become unconscious. Then, a last gleam of hope, the thought of my pistol flashed through my mind. I stretched out my hand, and as I lay, I could just reach the end of the barrel. I drew it towards me, and with an expiring effort, pushed the muzzle of it close against what I took to be the invisible body of my tormentor, and fired. We never found the bullet, or any trace of it afterwards. Instantly the hands relaxed their grip on my throat a little, and with a violent effort I wrenched my neck away. Then a heavy body fell sideways from my bed to the ground, and I fell too, grappling with it. At that moment Ellen and Prescott, who had been aroused by the sound of the shot, burst into the room. There they saw me struggling, partly on the floor and partly kneeling, apparently on space. They rushed to my assistance. Both of them felt the thing. Both of them grappled with it. The struggles of our enemy became fainter. Managing to get one hand free, I repossessed myself of the pistol which had fallen on the floor and emptied the second barrel into what I judged to be the breast of the spectre. I fired straight downwards, apparently at the floor, but of that bullet we saw no more than of the other. Meanwhile, Prescott stabbed furiously with the bowie knife, and each time he dashed the blade down, its progress was arrested before it reached the carpet. Then the struggles ceased, and nothing was heard except our rapid panting. We were all kneeling on and holding down what looked like space, and felt like the form of a tall and athletic man. We've done for it, whatever it is, I said, hoarsely. Prescott burst into a foolish giggle. By Jove, he said, we'll make a cast of it and see what it's like. As he spoke, the form of our victim was agitated by a desperate convulsion which shook us all off. Before we could seize it again, a deep groan burst from the place where we had held it, and the word "lettuce" rang through the room in a tone of sepulchral melancholy. Then there was silence. I threw myself on the floor, not, as I had intended, on the prostrate figure. We searched the room and then the house, but we could find absolutely nothing. Nor from that day to this has anyone, to the best of my knowledge, seen, heard, or felt anything whatever of this ghastly being. After much consideration, we determined to keep the adventure to ourselves, for a time at any rate. Indeed, it was only last summer, when we had lived in the house for a good number of years without any kind of ghostly interruption, that I described the circumstances herein narrated to my wife. She doesn't believe them, and I'm sorry I told her. Was it the ghost of Ronald Maisie? Did it voluntarily depart and leave us alone because it considered that the annoyances it had inflicted upon my ancestors and me were sufficient, and that the tale of its vengeance upon our house for the wrongs, whatever they were, inflicted upon Ronald in his lifetime by Andrew and Lettice was complete? Or did we actually kill it? Perhaps we did. He was a poor, weak creature when he was alive.
Everybody dies. Everybody dies. Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the long road, didn't you?
How do they come
He was a poor, weak creature when he was alive. He was a poor, weak creature when he was alive. He was a poor, weak creature when he was alive. I just enjoyed saying that. I did a number of takes of the end. I thought it was rather over the top, but see what you think. Because it's your opinion that counts anyway. That was number 11, Wellham Square by Sir Herbert Stephen. And as this is the commentary part, I'm going to tell you a little story a bit later. What I try to do is I have an idea and I think, no, keep your narrative. Don't go off on a tangent yet. And I think I'm going to save it. And I'm always very conscious I'm going to forget it. So all the time I'm then keeping to my narrative, I'm not really keeping to my narrative. And my words are coming out of my mouth related in a half-hearted way because they're not fully engaged with my thoughts, if you know what I mean. And the thought is thinking, remember this, remember this, remember this, remember this. And then I'm looking for an opportunity to say it. So I should really just go off on a tangent. I've had to open the window because unusually it is warm here. It's 28.6 degrees in this room. Windows are open, breeze, motorbikes. Scrapman is not making a lot of noise right now. Strange, he must be sick or something. I haven't heard him all day. So it's been a pleasant day. I've been with the took the old dogs out for about 4.5 miles, I think it was. And then I went to my personal trainer, Ryan. We talked about various things he makes me do. I said to him, so how come it gets harder every week? He says, that's how it works, mate. We discussed our mutual dislike of fish. Neither of us really like fish. I kind of like chip shop fish because it doesn't really taste like fish. If anything tastes of fish, I don't like it. And he says he likes sushi, and I said, well, that's weird. He says, because it doesn't really... He didn't actually say that. I said, is it because it doesn't taste like fish? And he said, well, I don't know, I just like it. Anyway, back to the story. Let me tell you something about, because I've forgotten the point I was going to mention now, of course, of Sir Herbert. So Sir Herbert Stephen, born June 25th. Yesterday! It was his birthday yesterday. It's Sheila's birthday today. We're going out to Alexandros tonight to the Greek restaurant. We may have guest fan. And it'll be nice, and I'll dress up for I'll put a shirt on. No trousers. No, that's a joke. I will wear trousers and perhaps a jacket, a light summer jacket. I know what I was going to say. I remembered. And it was my accent avatar And I'm not totally consistent with this, but when I do a Glaswegian, I'm aiming for Kevin Bridges always, and also Glas Vegas. They've got a song about "You don't want to stab me, you don't know my family and their capabilities." So I was in Glasgow on Friday last and Saturday. I love Glasgow. It was really nice to me in Glasgow when they're sober. No, I don't really drink as much, not really much at all, so I didn't go out for a drink, so I didn't encounter any drunken people. But everybody was sober. It was absolutely lovely. I'm not saying there was a lot of drunken people. I didn't see anybody drunk, so I don't really think that. Oh God, I've just offended the whole city, and despite the fact I really like Glasgow, and I didn't mean to. Anyway, so Kevin Bridges is my avatar for my Glaswegian accent, and I was wondering who was my avatar for my posh accent, and I think it's Douglas Murray, and I don't think I've quite got him because he's got a bit more of a lisp. I could have done Boris Johnson, lots of this, and Seneca, and Seneca. Well, the thing is, I could have done that, but I don't think that works. So I think certainly number 11 Wem Square was written by Sir Herbert Stephen under the pseudonym. I noticed when I listened back to my words that some of my vowels would drop. So, I need to lift the E up, because in posh English all the vowels are lifted. Cat, well, wonder, not wonder, wonder. So I need to remember to do that, because I notice I drop that sometimes assiduously. Yeah, so yeah, I'm going to keep watching Douglas Murray's videos so I can master his accent. He's very angry about things, but he puts it in a very eloquent way. So, and for American, just to balance politically, I should do Noam Chomsky. I do a bit of muttering. Yeah, so perhaps not. We haven't even got to talk about the story. We started at the beginning talking about Sir Herbert Stephen, not Sir Humphrey Appleby. When I was searching for details about Sir Herbert Stephen, I kept coming up with Sir Humphrey Appleby from Yes Minister, but they're not the same person. So there he was, and it was his birthday yesterday. He would have been. I don't know if I can even calculate this. He was born in 1857. So to take him to the end of the century, that would be 53. So that's to 1900. So to 2000, he's 153. So then we have 20. So 173, and we had 4, so he's 177 yesterday. His main career, he was born into a legal erudite family. His father, Sir James Fitzjames Stephen, what a name, was an eminent judge and philosopher, and his uncle, Sir Leslie Stephen, was the first editor of the Dictionary of National Biography. I am not yet in that, and I may never be. I've got to reconcile myself to that. Setting a high standard within the family for both academic and literary excellence. He was educated at Rugby and Trinity College, Cambridge. Now, there's a story that says he was educated at Eton and King's College. That's not true. That's M.R. James. Herbert Stephen distinguished himself in the study of law. He became a barrister at the Inner Temple in 1881. Isn't that great, the Inner Temple? He was appointed as clerk of the assize for the Northern Circuit. Good lad. A position he held from the 1889 to 1927. I've got another digression. This might be a long one, but hopefully I'll be able to hook it back at the end and rejoin seamlessly, so you will hardly notice if I hadn't told you that we were going on a little bit of a journey. So, I've got these 3 channels. I've got 4 actually on YouTube, and 3 podcasts. One is Ghosts, second is Detectives, third is Literature. So I've just been doing some stories by Stefan Zweig, and even the one, Virginia Woolf, D.H. Lawrence, I'll come back to him, and I did Vladimir Nabokov. Some absolutely fantastic stories. So a YouTuber said, interesting, this is a digression upon a digression, YouTubers said that they're not going to allow me to monetize because I don't bring anything to them. Okay, you what? Anyway, I've decided not to be splenetic about it, and just kind of, and do you know what they mean by that? Because I decided, after having some very unpleasant comments about my commentaries, and I was wounded, I was really hurt, I've overcome it now, but I didn't do them on those, particularly because I thought people who are interested in literature can be really snobbish, aren't they? And be, oh, blah, 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 I'm Professor blah, blah, and you got a full stop wrong, and your opinion of this is trash. And I'm like, yeah, all right, pal. But YouTube says, we want your commentaries. And I'm like, well, if YouTube want my commentaries, who are you, pipsqueaks? So there's going to be commentaries on all those, and there's going to be the wisdom and wit, both of which are in short supply, of Tony Walker about literature. So that, yeah, it was funny, YouTube wanted them despite, anyway, I did the D.H. Lawrence story. Now, if you know anything about D.H. Lawrence, he was son of a miner from Nottinghamshire, just outside Nottingham. And so he was a, you know, my grandfather was a miner. So, you know, I'm kind of closer to G.H. Lawrence than I am to Vladimir Nabokov. But some geezer said, the reader's bass, vibrato and regional accent made it unintelligible. Like, seriously, man? Even if I speak like proper Northern, you still can understand me. I can understand people from Alabama and Melbourne and Skibbereen. So actually, it's a push with Skibbereen, but and Glasgow sometimes, although sometimes not. Mostly, I get Glasgow accents. One time we were going to see Heilung, a German Norwegian band at the Barrowlands Ballroom, and we parked, and I wasn't sure if this was a public parking place. There was a guy in a high-vis jacket sitting down. I may have told this story, and I said to him, "Is this public parking? Will it be open?" And he said something to me, and no, I didn't. He had the broadest accent, and so Limmy owns this. I didn't understand what he was saying at all. You'll know who Limmy is maybe. If you don't, look him up. He's funny. Yeah, I didn't understand him. So I don't believe this bloke. And then I'm going to tell you something. I'm not a psycho. I'm not a psycho. I'm trying to convince myself of this. And what happened was, he had his profile picture on his comments, so I clicked on it. Indignantly, I should say. And there he was, sitting there, a bloke. And I want to tell you this. He was wearing jeans and trainers, that's sneakers to Americans. And he had a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge behind him. And I'm like, okay. I can't believe he's American. I don't think an American would have said that. They're too polite. So I'm taking he's British. If he's American, what the hell does he know about regional accents? No offence. But you'll admit that's true, isn't it? There's very few Americans. Gwyneth Paltrow maybe, because she did a good one. And various people on Game of Thrones, they were excellent. And in The Hobbit, they were excellent as well. The ones doing the British accents, you wouldn't have known. And Jenny Lane, she's brilliant. Jenny Lane does a fantastic English accent that you wouldn't know that she wasn't from the south of England, and she's lived in San Francisco. I hope she doesn't mind me telling people. It's a big city, unlikely. She just voiced, apart from me in the latest Ashridge, she plays the publican, the owner of the pub, Susan Devant, with a weird French name. I don't know where I got that from. Devant. I don't know, it just popped out of my head, as many things do, and pop out of my gob and all. And anyway, so this guy's sitting there in his jeans. I'm like, listen, if you're trying to be posh, you don't sit in your jeans and your trainers on a tyre or whatever he's sitting on. I won't give you his name, but I took umbrage. Where does that leave us? Oh yeah, Douglas Murray, we talked about that. I don't know. Let's talk about the story. So mainly, so Herbert Stephen was mainly, he got a Sir for being a clerk of the Northern Assize. He must have hung a lot of people or been involved in the hangings of a lot of people. Anyway, 11 Square was written by him. It was published in the Cornhill magazine in 1885 under the pseudonym Edward Maisie, so he's pretending it's a true story. Illustrations by George du Maurier. Now, I remember being in Hampstead last year, and there's a cafe in Hampstead now, an exhibition of the du Maurier family, including Daphne du Maurier is one of my heroes. I think she's a fantastic writer, and Yeah, he's one of them as well. George de Maurier, the illustrator, but of a different generation, obviously. So let's talk about the story. So it's actually well written. The other thing, if you read the obituary of Sir Herbert Stephen, which I did from the Times in 1930 odd, he was a correspondent to the newspapers and very erudite on legal matters, and apparently a great prose master. This story, if you think about the construction of it, three parts. Really, he's a young boy, and he introduces the story. He hints at it, a lovely bit of foreshadowing. You don't get the details, and then he says he purports to have collected this and pretends to be Edward Maisie. So he's trying to. Of course, it's a double bluff. It's a literary device. Nobody really probably thought he was Edward Maisie, and he knew they didn't. So it's like it's performative, isn't it? It's like we all know. It's like when you say something to somebody, it's not actually the words you say that are the meaning. They're performing. How are you? You don't actually care. Or not a bad day today. These are Britishisms. Well, it might or it might not be, but it's not. You're not actually doing it because you care about the weather. You're doing it to create a greeting. So you're using the words to perform a social role, which has nothing to do with the actual words. And I suppose this is the case. He knew most probably that nobody really would imagine he was Edward Maisie. So there we are. I'll just throw that in. And then, so the first chapter is about that, and then he collects the historical stuff. And two things to say. One is the classic Gothic haunted house. We want them. We love them. I'm going to tell you a little thing, a trick I've got. And this is a true thing. When I use a thumbnail picture of a haunted house, I get double or triple the listens. Crackers, isn't it? Doesn't matter what the story is. The second feature is the title, but the thumbnail of a haunted house, I could put a picture of a person or of something else relevant to the story. The haunted house picture sells the episode. It's a true thing. Why? It's just psychology. So yeah, we love a haunted house, a goth, and it's Gothic, isn't it? It goes back to the 18th century. It's described. It's all creaky. It's dark and shadowy. It's got lots of stairs and rooms and all of that. Gothic. So, and the second thing is, of course, the thing you need in a ghost story is the sin. You need a sin to explain why the ghost has come to. In most cases, ghosts seek to right wrongs. This is, in a sense, it is, and he says that at the end, that this Maisie lad who was slow, and basically, it's a safeguarding issue. It would be these days. He was abused really by his relatives, exploited, and he's come back to get his revenge on the family. And they were like cousins, so obviously there's, your cousin isn't your family. Well, I think your cousin is your family, but it obviously to them, So the sin is that exploitation and abuse of the lad, and the ghost has come back to right the wrongs. And then the next thing is we have the build-up of he always going into the house, and it's a lovely plausible reason. He set it up at the beginning. Remember, you've got to set these things up for them to be believed. So if I've said this many times, if you set it up and then reveal 2 sentences later, the readers go, oh yes, swizz. But if you set it up at the very beginning and then you reveal it 30 pages later, readers go, oh right, absolutely works. It's a little trick, but it works. So if you're going to foreshadow far ahead. The further ahead you foreshadow, the cleverer your reader thinks you are. You're not. It's just a technique, but they fall for it every time, like the thumbnail. And so yes, we set that up. I've forgotten what I was saying. The sin is punished. Yeah. The middle bit is the ghostly, and I was quite scary of it. And then at the end, we lapsed into Victoriana, and for these late Victorian stories, they'd got tired of the Gothic. Jane Austen had made fun of the Gothic in Northanger Abbey a bit earlier, so it was a people didn't take them seriously. It's like vampire stories these days. After Twilight, you've got to work really hard to get a vampire story that people will take seriously. I'll just cough a little bit here and say I have my Unreal City, which of course does exactly that. So if you haven't heard my Unreal City audiobook, just search for it and you love it. If you like vampire stories, it's a good one. Everybody says so. My mum used to say so. She didn't. She never read it. Nobody in my family ever reads my work. None of my family ever read my work. They just go, that's nice. You know, I'm not complaining. Well, yes, I am, I suppose. But, yeah, anyway, where were we? So we get to the end, we have the Victorian yarn. So what I'm saying is they'd become sick of the supernatural, and a lot of in many cases the stories turn out not to be. They turn out to be Scooby-Doo situations. They're not really supernatural. It's some kind of scam going on. This is supernatural. He doesn't go quite as far as that to debunk it, but it becomes like an adventure story, doesn't it? And I think if we place him, we have Dickens and Le Fanu and early to mid-Victorian, and we have Elizabeth Gaskell's Gothic stories, early Victorian. Then we have kind of people who are mid-Victorian, so a bit earlier than this, but a couple of decades earlier than this, but people like Amelia Edwards, and then we have Charlotte Riddell, and we have things like The Phantom Coach and The Open Door. There are two. Margaret Oliphant did the Scottish version of that, which is probably a better story. But the Charlotte Riddell Open Door is still good. And they turn out to be, wheezes. You know, somebody, some criminal or something is trying to. So, and it gets, so it isn't, if you think of M.R. James, can you imagine M.R. James getting in his heroes getting in a fist fight, or drawing a Bowie knife or a Bowie knife? Somebody will complain about me saying Bowie, they absolutely will, and drawing a Bowie knife or a gun and shooting the ghost. M.R. James is not going to do it. I don't think even Sheridan Le Fanu does it. Early generation, before it became so hackneyed, and M.R. James brings it back to the supernatural, but this little piece, and even Dickens's stories, his ghosts are, with the exception of the Ghost of Christmas Future, yet to come, I don't think they're really scary. Marley's a little bit scary, but and you know the goblins who stole the sexton and all that kind of stuff they've used. I do a Christmas story of Dickens every year, so at Christmas. So, but we lapse into we're not really scared of you ghosts kind of thing. And I think that's what happens in the third chapter. This becomes a yarn. It becomes, and then, as I said, later on the ghost story is rescued in the early 20th century by the psychological ghost stories. I mean, we haven't mentioned, of course, The Turn of the Screw, Henry James, where he really brings home the psychology and makes it really scary again. And then Robert Aikman going into the weirdness. But a whole bunch of people very late, I suppose Edwardian going forward, they make it scary again. But in this period when Herbert Stevens writing, they are lapsing into the rumbustious ones. And I think a bit like the Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes stuff, The Hound of the Baskervilles is a good example of this. It could be supernatural. It's put out the supernatural, but it is debunked. I've done The Hound of the Baskervilles. I love doing it. If you haven't heard my version of The Hound of the Baskervilles, please go and listen to it, because just please, I can't think of any good reason. I mean, I hope you enjoy it, but I was going to say because it's great, but I enjoyed doing it. I think it's all right. I think I did a good job, but you will be the judge of that. It's underserved, it's under-listened to, I think. Also, The Phantom of the Opera, that was fantastic to do. Go and listen to that. Listen, if you take all my suggestions now, you'll be listening for 4 weeks, and you won't be doing anything else. You won't peel the potatoes, you won't take the dog for a walk, you won't go out for a meal on your partner's birthday, which I am. So anyway, that's probably all I want to say. I hope you're all alright. Nip over to my classic literature stories channel. There's some absolutely knock your block off stories there. Honestly, stories that have really moved me. And you can see, I'm going to sound like one of them snobs I was decrying earlier. You can see, yeah, I love a good ghost story, clearly. I love a good detective story. But those really speak to humanity, those literary stories. And I think that's why I used to slag them off, didn't I? I used to say, well, I think then later in the later 20th century, the literary novel became just, as I say, some angst-ridden story about rather neurotic person spending a rainy weekend in Dinan in Brittany, thinking about his past and the loves he lost. And they're fairly dull. But yeah, no, when it's done well, it's done well. It's just doing it well, isn't it? Not everybody's as clever as they think they are, including me. Do I think I'm clever? Oh, well, whatever I think, I'm not as clever as I think I am, and that's a rule of thumb. I just sit on my desk here. I don't know if you buy anything from Temu. You probably shouldn't. I hope they don't block me, but they send me all these, and they've got all these fantastic things, and they're like tuppence. They take 7 years to come from China, but when they do come, you look at them and you think, yeah, that's not very good quality, really. But I've got this coin they sold me, which is actually quite nice. It's a big coin. It's the size of an old crown, a half crown, something like that. Big, silver, metal, and it has a yes on one side and no on the other. And you throw it, you get the idea. You toss the coin, it tells you whether you should or shouldn't do things like cross the road, yes, no, oh, okay, I'm here. Go for a meal with Sheila, yes, no, that could lead me into a lot of trouble. So I have used it a little bit, but I'm actually pretty good at making decisions. Snap, foolish decisions that I later come to regret. I actually don't regret them. Usually don't regret them. I'm just like really impulsive, as you can tell. Need two shots of Ritalin just to calm me down. Anyway, I better go. He was a weak fellow. When alive, I've forgotten the line now. I looked it up, here's the pirate version. We were a poor weak creature when he were alive. And my final point is, somebody actually put a comment that made me laugh. Tony Walker, he was brilliant at the start, but he's gone bonkers now. As if. The Garside Fell Disaster by LTC wrote. Yes, sir, I'm an old railwayman, I am, and proud of it. You see, I come of a railway family, as you might say, for I reckon there've been boothroids on the railway, in the signal cabin or on the footplate mostly, ever since old Geordie Stevenson was about. We haven't always served the same company. There were 4 of us. My 2 elder brothers followed my father on the North Western, but I joined the Grand Trunk, and Bert, our youngest, he went east to Grantham. He hadn't been long there before he was firing on one of Patrick Sterling's 8-foot singles, the prettiest little locos as ever was, or ever will be, I reckon. He finished up driver on Ivert's Atlantics, while Harry and Fred were working jumbos and precursors out of crew. I could have had the footplate job myself, easy enough, if I'd a mind. Took it in with my mother's milk, I did, if you follow my meaning. But, and sometimes, I'm not so sure as I don't regret it. I married early on, and the old woman persuaded me to go for a more settled job. So, it was the signal box for me. The driver's wife's a widow most of the week, see, unless he happens to click for a regular local turn. The first job I had on my own was at Garside on the Carlisle line south of Highbeck Junction, and it was here that this business, as I was speaking of, happened. A proper bad do it was, and the rummest thing as ever I had happen in all my time. Now, you could travel the railways from one end to the other, Scotland and all, but I doubt you'd find a more lonesome spot than Garside, or one so mortal cold in winter. I don't know if you've ever travelled that road, but all I know is it must have cost a mint of money. You see, the Grand Trunk wanted their own road to Scotland, but the East Coast lot had taken the easiest pick, and the North Western had the next best run through Preston and over Shap. So, there was nothing else for them but to carry their road over the mountains. It took a bit of doing, I can tell you. And I know, for when I was up there was plenty of folks about who remembered the railway coming. They told me what a game it was, what with the snow and the wind, and the clay that was like rock in summer, and the treacle pudding in winter. Garside Box, it takes its name from Garside Fell, same as the tunnel. There's no station there, for there isn't a house in sight, let alone a village. And my cottage was down at Frithdale, about half an hour's walk away. It was what we call a section box, just a small box, the signals and two lie-by roads, one on the up and one on the downside, where goods trains could stand to let the fast trains through if need be. Maybe you know how the block system works, how you can only admit one train onto a section at a time. Well, it would have been an 8-mile section, heavily graded at that from Highbeck to Enniswaite, the next station south, and it might have taken a heavy goods anything up to half an hour to clear it. That's why they made 2 sections of it by building Garside Box, just midway between the two. It was over 1,000 feet up, not far short of the summit of the line in fact. Looking south from my box, I could see that summit, top of the long bank up from Enniswaite. Just north of the box was the mouth of the tunnel, 1.5 miles of it under Garside Fell. If ever you should come to walk over those mountains, you couldn't miss the ventilation shaft of the tunnel. It looks kind of queer to see those great stone towers a-smoking and steaming away up there in the heather, miles and miles from anywhere, with not a soul for company, and all so quiet. Not that they smoke now as much as they did, but I'll be coming to that presently. Well, as I've said before, you could travel the length and breadth of England before you'd find a lonelier place than Garside. Job Micklewright, who was a ganger on the section, would generally give me a look up when he went by, and if I switched the goods into the lie-by, more often than not the fireman or the guard would pass the time of day, give me any news from down the line, and maybe make a can of tea on my stove. But otherwise, I wouldn't see a soul from the time I came on till I got my relief. Of course, there was the trains, but then you couldn't call them company, not properly speaking. Hundreds and hundreds of folks must have passed me by every day, and yet there I was, on my own, with only a few old sheep for company, and the birds crying up on the moor. Funny that, when you come to think of it, isn't it? Mind you, I'm not saying it wasn't grand to be up there on a fine day in summer. You could keep your town life then. It made you feel as it was good to be alive, what with the sun a-shining and the heather all out, grasshoppers ticking away, and the air fairly humming with bees. Yes, you got to notice little things like that. And as for the smell of the moor in summer, why, I reckon I can smell it now. It was a different tale in winter, though. Cold? Fair makes me shiver to think on it. I've known the wind set in the northeast for months on end, what we call a lazy wind. Blows through, you see, too tired to go round. Sometimes it blew that strong it was all you could do to stand against it. More than once I had the glass of my windows blown in, and there were times when I thought the whole cabin was going, what with the roaring and rattling and shaking of it. Just you imagine climbing a signal ladder to fix a lamp in that sort of weather. It wasn't easy to keep those lamps in, I can tell you. Then there was the snow. You don't know what snow is down here in the south. The company was well off for ploughs, and we'd no lack of good engines even on those days, but it used to beat them. Why, I've known it snow for 2 days and a night, blowing half a gale all the time, and at the end of it there's been a drift of snow 20 feet deep in the cutting up by the tunnel. But in spite of all the wind and the snow and the rain, Lord, how it could rain. It was the mists I hated most. That may sound funny to you, but then no signalman can bear mist and fog. It kind of blinds you, and that makes you uneasy. It's for the signalman to judge whether he shall call out the fogmen, and that is a big responsibility. It may come up sudden after sundown in autumn. You calls your fogmen, and by the time they come on, it's all cleared off, and they want to know what the hell you're playing at. So another time you put off calling them, but it don't clear, and before you know where you are, you've got trains overrunning signals. We had no fogmen at Garside, there was little occasion for them, but we kept a box of detonators in the cabin. All the same, I didn't like the fog no more for that. They're queer things, are those mountain mists. Sometimes all day I'd see one hanging on the moor, perhaps only 100 yards away, but never seeming to come no nearer. And then all of a sudden, down it would come, so thick that in a minute, no more, I couldn't see my home signals. But there was another sort of fog at Garside that I liked even less, and that was the sort that came out from the tunnel. Ah, now that strikes you as funny, doesn't it? Maybe you're thinking that with such a lonesome job, I took to fancying things. Oh, I know. If you're a nervy chap, it's easy to see things in the mist as there's no right to be there, or to hear queer noises when really it's only the wind shouting around and humming in the wires. But I wasn't that sort. And what's more, I wasn't the only one who found out that there was something that wasn't quite right about Garside. No, you can take it from me that what I'm telling you is gospel, as true as I'm sitting in this bar talking to you. No doubt you've often looked at the mouth of the railway tunnel and noticed how the smoke comes a-curling out even though there may not be the sight or sound of traffic. Well, the first thing I noticed about Garside Tunnel was that for all its ventilation shaft, it was the smokiest hole I'd ever seen. Not that this struck me as queer, at least not at first. I remember though, soon after I came there, I was walking up from Frithedale one Monday morning for the early turn and saw that number 2 shaft way up on the fell was smoking like a factory chimney. That did seem a bit strange, for there was precious little traffic coming through on a Sunday in those days. In fact, Garside Box was locked out and they worked the full 8-mile section. Still, I didn't give much thought to it until one night about 3 weeks later. It was almost dark, but not so dark that I couldn't just see the tunnel mouth and the whitish-looking smoke sort of oozing out of it. Now both sections were clear, mind. The last train through had been an up Class A goods, and I'd had the out-of-section from Highbeck South Box a good half hour before. But, believe it or not, that smoke grew more and more as I watched it. At first I thought it must be a trick of the wind blowing through the tunnel, though the air seemed still enough for once in a way. But it went on, coming out thicker and thicker, until I couldn't see the tunnel itself at all, and it came up the cutting toward my box for all the world like a wall of fog. 1 minute, there was a clear sky overhead. The next minute, gone. And the smell of it was fit to choke you. The railway tunnels are smelly holes at the best of times, but that smell was different somehow, and worse than anything I'd ever struck. It was so thick round my box that I was thinking of looking out my fog signals when a bit of a breeze must have got up, for on a sudden it was gone as quick as it came. The moon was up, and there was the old tunnel plain in the moonlight, just smoking away innocent-like as though nothing had happened. Fair made me rub my eyes. "Alf," says I to myself, "you been dreaming." But all the while I knew I hadn't. At first I thought I'd best keep it to myself, but the same thing happened 2 or 3 times in the next month or so, till one day, casual-like, I mentioned it to Perce Shaw, who was my relief. He'd had it happen too, it seemed, but like me, he hadn't felt like mentioning it to anyone. "Well," I says to him, "it's my opinion there's something queer going on, something that's neither right nor natural. But if there's one man who should know more than we do, it's Job Micklewright. After all," I says, "he walks through the blinking tunnel." Job didn't need much prompting to start him off. The very next morning it was, if I remember rightly, the old tunnel was smoking away as usual when out he comes. He climbs straight up into my box, blows out his light and sits down by my stove, warming himself, for the weather was sharp. "Cold morning," I says. "Ah," he says, rubbing his hands, "strikes cold it does after being in there." "Why?" I asked. "Is it that warm inside there, Job?" "Certainly looks pretty thick. Reckon you must have a job to see your way along." Job said nothing for a while, only looked at me a bit old-fashioned, and went on rubbing his hands. Then he says, quiet-like, "I reckon you won't be seeing much more of me, Alf." That surprised me. "Why?" I asks. "'Cause I've put in for a shift," he says. "I've had enough of this beat." "How's that, Job?" I says. "Don't you fancy that old tunnel?" He looked up sharp at that. "What makes you talk that road?" he asks. "Have you noticed something too, then?" I nodded my head and told him what I'd seen, which was little enough, really, when you come to weigh it up. But Job went all serious over it. "Alf," he says, "I've been a good chapel man all my life. I never touch a drop of liquor. You know that. And you know as I wouldn't tell you the word of a lie. Well then, I'm telling you, Al, he says, as that tunnel's no fit place for a God-fearing man. What you've seen's the least of it. I know no more than you what it may be, but there's something in there that I don't want no more truck with. Something I fear worse than the Day of Judgment. It's bad, and it's getting worse. That's why I'm going to flit. First I noticed nothing funny except it was a bit on the smoky side and never seemed to clear proper. Then I found it got terrible stuffy and hot in there, especially between 2 and 3 shafts. Very dry it is in there, not a wet patch anywhere. And one day, when I dodged into a manhole to let a train by, I found the bricks was warm. That's a rum do, I says to myself. Since then, the smoke or the fog or whatever it may be has been getting thicker. And maybe it's my fancy or maybe it's not. But it strikes me that there's queer things moving about in it, things I couldn't lay name to, even if I could see them proper. And as for the heat, proper stifling. Why, I could take you in now, and you'd find as you couldn't bear your hand on the bricks round about the place I know of. This last couple or 3 days has been the worst of all. For I've seen lights moving and darting about in the smoke, mostly round about the shaft openings. Only little ones, mind, the kind of flickering like flames, only they don't make no sound. And the heat in there's fit to smother you. I've kept it to myself till now. I haven't even told the missus, for I thought if I let on, folks would think I was off my head. What it all means, Alf, only the Lord himself knows. All I know is I've had enough. Now, I must say, in spite of what I'd seen, I took old Job's yarn with a pinch of salt myself, until a couple of nights after. And then I saw something that made me feel that maybe he was right after all. It had just gone dark, and I was walking back home down to Frithedale, when, chancing to look round, I saw there was a light up on the fell. It was just a kind of dull glow shining on smoke, like as if the moor was afire, somewhere just out of sight over the ridge. But it wasn't the time of year for heather burning. The moor was like a wet sponge. And when I looked again, I saw without much doubt that it was coming from the tunnel shaft. Mind you, I wouldn't have cared to stake my oath on it at the time. It was only faint like, but I did not like the look of it at all. That was the night of February the 1st, 1897. I can tell you that because it was exactly a fortnight to the night of the Garside disaster, and that's a date I shall never forget as long as I live. I can remember it all as though it was yesterday. It was a terrible, rough night, raining hard, and the wind that strong over the moor you could hardly stand against it. I was on the early turn that week, so the missus and I had gone to bed about 10. The next thing I knew was her shaking and shaking at my shoulder and calling, "Alf, Alf, wake up, there's summat up." What with the wind roaring and rattling around, it was a job to hear yourself think. "Well, what's up?" I asks, fuddled like. "Look out of the window," she cries out. "There's a fire up on fell, summat's up, I tell you." Next minute, I was pulling on my clothes, but there wasn't any doubt about it this time. Out there in the dark, the tunnel shafts were flaming away like ruddy beacons. Just you try to imagine a couple of those old-fashioned iron furnaces flaring out on the top of a mountain at the back of beyond, and you'll maybe understand why the sight put the fear of God into us. I set off up to Garside Box just as fast as I could go, and most of the menfolk out of the village after me, for many of them had been wakened by the noise of the storm, and those who hadn't soon got the word. I had a hurricane lamp with me, but I could hardly see the box for the smoke that was blowing down the cutting from the tunnel. Inside I found Pearse Shaw in a terrible taking. His hair was all singed, his face was as white as that wall, and "My God," or "You can't do nothing," was all he'd say, over and over again. I got through to Ennisford and Highbeck South and found that they'd already had the section blocked from Pearse. Then I set the detonators on the down line just in case and went off up to the tunnel, but I couldn't do no good. But with the heat and the smoke, I was suffocating before I'd got 100 yards inside. By the time I got back to the box, I found that Job Micklewright and some of the others had come up, and that they'd managed to quiet Pearse enough to tell us what had happened. midnight, it seems, he took an upgoods from Highbeck South box, and a few minutes later got the entering section. 10 minutes after that, he accepted the down night Mountaineer from Ennisford. That was one of our crack trains in those days, night sleeper with mails, first stop Carlisle. Now, it's a bank of 1 in 70 most of the way up from Highbeck, so it might take a heavy goods quarter of an hour to clear that section. But when the 15 minutes was up and still no sign of her, Pearce began to wonder a bit. Thought she must be steaming bad. Then he caught the sound of the Mountaineer beating it up the bank from Ennisford, well up to her time, for the wind was set that road. But he didn't see no cause then to hold her up, Highbeck having accepted her. But just as he heard her top the bank and start gathering speed, a great column of smoke came driving down the cutting, and he knew that there was something wrong, for there was no question of it being anything but smoke this time. Whatever was up in the tunnel, it was too late to hold up the Mountaineer. He put his home on, but she'd already passed the distant, and he doubted whether her driver saw it in the smoke. The smoke must have warned him though, for he thought he heard him shut off and put on the vacuum just as he went into the tunnel, but he was travelling very fast, and he must have been too late. He hoped that the noise he heard, distant like, was only the wind, but running as she was, she should have cleared Highbeck South box in under 4 minutes. So when the time went by and no out of section came through, what he must have felt waiting there for that little bell to ring twice and once, he sent out the section blocked both roads and went off up the line to see what he could do. What exactly happened in the tunnel, we shall never know. We couldn't get in for 24 hours on account of the heat, and then we found both trains burnt out, and not a mortal soul alive. At the inquiry, they reckoned a spark from the goods loco must have set a train afire while she was pulling up the bank through the tunnel. The engine of the Mountaineer was derailed. They thought a driver, seeing he couldn't pull up his train in time, had taken the only chance and put on speed, hoping to get his train by, but that burning wreckage had fouled his road. Pearce got no blame, but then we only told him what we knew, not what we thought. Pearce and I, especially Job Micklewright, might have said a lot more than we did, but it wouldn't have done no good, and it might have done us a lot of harm. The 3 of us got moved from Garside after that. Mighty glad we were to go too, and I've never heard anything queer about the place since. Mind you, we talked about it a lot between ourselves. Pearce and I reckoned the whole thing was a sort of warning of what was going to happen. But Job, who was a local chap born and bred, he thought different. He said that way back in the old days, they had another name for Garside Fell. Holy Mountain, they called it, though to my way of thinking, unholy would have been nearer the mark. When he was a larlin, it seems, the old folks down in Friftdale and roundabout used to tell queer tales about it. Anyway, Job had some funny idea in his head that there was something in that old mountain that should never have been disturbed, and he reckoned the fire kind of put things right again. Sort of a sacrifice, if you follow my meaning. I can't say I hold with such notions myself, but that's my tale of what the papers called the Garside Fell disaster, and you can make of it what you like.
Everybody dies. Everybody dies. Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room.
So that was the Garside Fell disaster by LTC Wrote, and it gave me a chance to be properly northern for a bit, rather than being attempting to be posh. Okay, so LTC Wrote was born Lionel Thomas Caswell Wrote on February 9th, 1910. He was an English writer known for his work in various genres. I've got a book by him about narrowboats. And also I've got this one, obviously, Sleep No More, which was his collection of ghost stories. So he's known, including ghost stories and non-fiction related to canals. I've just mentioned both of those. He is considered a prominent figure in the preservation and revival of the inland waterways of England. with Robert Aikman. I've got Robert Aikman's book, Know Your Waterways, and I can't find it. And so I've been rooting through piles of books and wasting lots of time, and I still haven't found it, but I'm frantic about finding it, because we're going on the waterways in a week's time. That's where we're going on holiday. So Rolt's interest in canals stemmed from his childhood experiences exploring the waterways of England with his father. This passion led him to become a prominent canal historian and advocate for their restoration in the mid-20th century. Rolt also dabbled in ghost stories, as we know, but these stories draw inspiration from the landscape and histories of the English countryside, combining elements of folklore, mystery and paranormal. Check. Some of Rolt's notable works include Sleep No More, Railway Canal, and other stories, Got That, and The House by the Canal, which I haven't got. Throughout his career, Rolt's writing reflected his deep appreciation for English heritage and industrial heritage, landscape, and the sense of nostalgia that pervaded his work. He died on 9th November 1974. So the Garside Fell disaster was in Sleep No More, his collection, published in 1955. Set in the rugged landscape of Garside Fell, revolves around a train disaster. You knew that. It looks at how has he created it? It's the remoteness, isn't it? M.R. James says, separate your people. He didn't say it just like that, but the idea is you put your person through you make them isolated, and also, as in all Gothic stories, you make the weather bad. They're on their own, the weather's bad, they're away from all help. That's the beginning of most of these. It's a pretty simple story, but good. I really liked it. So Garside Fell is a thinly disguised renaming of the Pennine Fells, along which the Settle and Carlisle line goes, so Settle in Yorkshire and Carlisle in Cumberland, over the high mountain. And I think the story of how it came to be there, whereas somebody grabbed the nice east coast line where it's pretty flat, and then somebody else had grabbed the west coast line through Preston up to Sharp, up to Scotland, and they had to go through the middle of the mountains. So that's all very true. And there were real life disasters. There was one at Hawes Junction and at A's Gill. This story's focus on signalmen anticipating disaster in isolated moorland locations. The anticipation of the whistle, the crash, or distant red glow evokes a sense of dread and uncertainty, creating a tense and gripping atmosphere as the characters await their fate. I also like the local lads, Job Micklewright. I knew a fellow called Micklethwaite. So Job Micklewright and Perce Shaw and our man Alf, whose second name I'm not sure is mentioned. One interesting thing is how the Garside Fell disaster explores the theme of hauntology. You may have heard me talk about hauntology, where the past haunts the present in unexpected ways. Through the retelling of historical railway tragedies and the eerie events that follow, the story blurs the boundaries between past and present, inviting reflection the lingering impact of history on the present moment. Yeah, I think as we are reflecting on it, so he wrote it in 55, reflecting on the past, we are kind of double reflection. I talked about the real life disasters. It's a very scenic line. If you ever get the chance to go on it, you should. It's very pretty. So Christmas Eve junction at Hawes Junction, 1910. A signalman's error led to a devastating collision between a northbound express train from London and a local passenger train from Lancashire. This collision resulted in substantial damage and numerous casualties, ranking it as one of the deadliest rail accidents in British history. Then there was another one at Ace Gill on the same line in 1913, further illustrating the challenges of operating railways in rugged terrain. An express passenger train travelling north derailed at Ace Gill's summit due to adverse weather conditions and track deficiencies. The derailment caused significant damage and injuries among passengers, highlighting the risks, etc., etc. So, inevitably, you're going to have comparisons with Dickens' The Signalman, of course, which I've done. I'll try and link that story to this one so you can go and listen to it if you haven't. Such similarities, railway settings, themes of premonition, ghostly warnings. Both stories have this railway environment, and they're both in cuttings as well, and they're both about a signalman. Charles Dickens himself was in a railway accident in 1865. If you've ever read the book Drood, which is by Dan Simmons, and it's about Dickens and Wilkie Collins as well, and it has a big section on that. Okay, so such similarities there, and both have this. The ghosts are never seen. They are, I think, in the end, in the Signal Man, does he see something? But the Signal Man sees something. But in this case, it's Job Micklethwaite who sees. I thought that was quite dreadful. This idea of being, I mean in the old sense, in a big, smoky, dark tunnel underground that's unnaturally hot, and there are things moving. I thought that was a lovely, spooky, a mid-20th century touch, really, and I liked it. Also, the other resonance I had was with the Balrog in Tolkien's Moria. You have this idea of an ancient evil which is disturbed by men tunnelling too deeply, and dwarves in that case, under the mountain, things that should not be disturbed. And another thing that you might not know, the naming. I don't think they would have called it Holy Mountain, they might have called it Holy Fell. Or Haley Fell? No, I can't think what the dialect for holy would be. Sealy, of course, is... Anyway, let's not go into that, that's Scots. So, there's a mountain called Crossfell, and there's a cross on it. But story goes, whether it's true or not, it used to be called Fiend's Fell, and it was the abode of the devil, and so they built this cross on top of it to drive the devil out, and so changed the name from Fiend's Fell to Crossfell. There you go. There's some truth. It also struck me, I'd written a little piece about, there's a story, supposedly a true story of a kind of ghostly train accident thing. A guy called Augustus Hare wrote a 6-volume autobiography, and you can read it on Gutenberg for free, called The Story of My Life, which was published in 1896, and he has got this story which he heard from a Mrs. T, who he didn't name, about a Dr. Watson. Now, Dr. Watson was a really famous doctor in the mid to late Victorian period. He was president of the Royal College of Physicians from 1862 to 1866. He was physician ordinary to Queen Victoria in 1870, when he was already 78. So the story goes that this Dr. Watson used to travel everywhere around the country to see his patients, was on a train. And he'd been called to go and see somebody in Oxenholme. Now the story says it's in Cumberland, but it's not, it's in Westmoreland. And it was known as Kendal Junction at that point. Although in the story it's known as Oxenholme, so somebody's meddled with the story a little bit. I got that story from Watkins' Book of English Folk Tales, which is a lovely book. And it's this excerpt from August Hare's book. Anyway, the story goes that Dr. Watson gets on a train, and he encounters a young woman who experiences visions of her fiancé urging her to disembark at various stations. So basically, he's on this train, and she's going further north. It's always the north. And he's getting off at Oxenholme, but she's very unwell, and he gives her some medicine, I think. And she is unwell, and he persuades her to get off at Crewe, I believe, rather than go forward, because she's so disturbed because her fiancé, who she's going to meet up in Scotland, I think, is urging her, his visitation is urging her to get off the train. So Dr. Watson just thinks she's ill, and he, being a gentleman, arranges her to stay in the hotel, the railway hotel in Crewe. All stations had a railway hotel in the good old days. And then the train crashes, and it's a real life disaster on that line. And her fiancé and everybody think that she's dead, but of course she isn't, because of the premonition. He doesn't know he's come to her. It's like what they call a living ghost, isn't it? Or a crisis apparition, whereby some part of him knew that this was going to happen, whether a future self. Very interesting, if true. Anyway, railway ghost stories, aren't they fun? I've kind of gone through that really quickly, and I'll tell you why, because I've got to go out and walk the dogs. It's been hot today, don't often say that, and they're frantic to go out, and it's 8:20 now, so still light, but I better take the dogs out, and they're giving me hassle. So anyway, the other thing I was going to say is, I don't know if you've heard my Ashridge folk horror series, which I'm doing as an audio drama on YouTube. It's going to come out as a podcast. We're producing episode 4 at the moment. Of course, There's a pub by the canal called the Admiral Benbow in episode 2, and the beer, the local craft beer there, is Rolt, named after this man, LTC Rolt. So that was some people got that, and as they heard it on YouTube. Okay, time to go. That's the light flicking on and off to tell me it's time to leave. Okay, thank you, bye.
Alright, okay.
That was Sheila flicking the light, not the dogs. The Quest of Iranon by H.P. Lovecraft. Into the granite city of Teloth wandered the youth, vine-crowned, his yellow hair glistening with myrrh, and his purple robe torn with briars of the mountain Sidrak that lies across the antique bridge of stone. The men of Teloth are dark and stern and dwell in square houses, and with frowns they asked the stranger whence he had come and what were his name and fortune. So the youth answered, I am Iranon, and I come from Ira, a far city that I recall only dimly but seek to find again. I am a singer of songs that I learned in the far city, and my calling is to make beauty with the things remembered of childhood. My wealth is in little memories and dreams, and in hopes that I sing in gardens when the moon is tender and the west wind stirs the lotus buds. When the men of Teloth heard these things, they whispered to one another, for though in the granite city there is no laughter or song, the stern men sometimes look to the Carthian hills in the spring and think of the loops of distant Unai, whereof travellers have told. And thinking thus, they bade the stranger stay and sing in the square before the tower of Mlin, though they liked not the colour of his tattered robe, nor the myrrh in his hair, nor his chaplet of vine leaves, nor the youth in his golden voice. At evening Iranon sang, and while he sang an old man prayed, and a blind man said he saw a nimbus over the singer's head. But most of the men of Teloth yawned, and some laughed, and some went to sleep. For Iranon told nothing useful, singing only his memories, his dreams, and his hope. I remember the twilight, the moon, the soft songs, and the window where I was rocked to sleep. And through the window was the street where the golden lights came, and where the shadows danced on houses of marble. I remember the square of moonlight on the floor that was not like any other light, and the visions that danced in the moonbeams when my mother sang to me. And too, I remember the sun of morning bright above the many-coloured hills in summer, and the sweetness of flowers born on the south wind that made the trees sing. O Ira, city of marble and beryl, how many are thy beauties! How loved I the warm and fragrant groves across the highling Nithra and the falls of the tiny Kra that flowed through the verdant valley. In those groves and in that vale the children wove wreaths for one another, and at dusk I dreamed strange dreams under the yath trees on the mountain, as I saw below me the lights of the city and the curving Nithra reflecting a ribbon of stars. And in the city were palaces of veined and tinted marble, with golden domes and painted walls, and green gardens with cerulean pools and crystal fountains. Often I played in the gardens and waded in the pools, and lay and dreamed among the pale flowers under the trees. And sometimes at sunset I would climb the long hilly street to the citadel in the open place, and look down upon Ira, the magic city of marble and beryl, splendid in a robe of golden flame. Long have I missed thee, Ira, for I was but young when we went into exile, but my father was thy king, and I shall come again to thee.
for it is so decreed of fate. All through 7 lands have I sought thee, and some day shall I reign over thy groves and gardens, thy streets and palaces, and sing to men who shall know whereof I sing, and laugh not, nor turn away. For I am Iranon, who was a prince in Ira. That night the men of Teloth lodged the stranger in a stable, and in the morning an Archon came to him and told him to go to the shop of Athok the cobbler and be apprenticed to him. But I am Iranon, a singer of songs, he said, and have no heart for the cobbler's trade. All in Teloth must toil, replied the Archon, for that is the law. Then said Iranon, wherefore do ye toil? Is it not that ye may live and be happy? And if ye toil only that ye may toil more, when shall happiness find you? Ye toil to live, but is not life made of beauty and song? And if ye suffer no singers among you, where shall be the fruits of your toil? Toil without songs is like a weary journey without an end. Were not death more pleasing? But the Archon was sullen, and did not understand, and rebuked the stranger. Thou art a strange youth, and I like not thy face nor thy voice. The words thou speakest are blasphemy, for the gods of Teloth have said that toil is good. Our gods have promised us a haven of light beyond death, where there shall be rest without end, and crystal coldness amidst which none shall vex his mind with thought, or his eyes with beauty. Go thou then to Athok the cobbler, or be gone out of the city by sunset. All here must serve, and song is folly. So Iranon went out of the stable and walked over the narrow stone streets between the gloomy square houses of granite, seeking something green in the air of spring. But in Teloth was nothing green, for all was of stone. On the faces of men were frowns, but by the stone embankment along the sluggish river Zuro sate a young boy with sad eyes, gazing into the waters to spy green budding branches washed down from the hills by the freshets. And the boy said to him, Art thou not indeed he of whom the Archons tell, who seekest a far city in a fair land? I am Romnod, and born of the blood of Teloth, but I am not old in the ways of the granite city, and yearn daily for the warm groves and the distant lands of beauty and song. Beyond the Carthian hills lieth Unai, the city of lutes and dancing, which men whisper of and say is both lovely and terrible. Thither would I go, were I old enough to find the way, and thither shouldst thou go, and thou wouldst sing and have men listen to thee. Let us leave the city, Teloth, and fare together among the hills of spring. Thou shalt show me the ways of travel, and I will attend thy songs at evening, when the stars one by one bring dreams to the minds of dreamers. And peradventure it may be that Unai, the city of lutes and dancing, is even the fair Ira thou seekest. For it is told that thou hast not known Ira since old days, and the name often changeth. Let us go to Unai, O Iranon of the golden head, where men shall know our longings and welcome us as brothers, nor ever laugh or frown at what we say. And Iranon answered, Be it so, small one, if any in this stone place yearn for beauty, ye must seek the mountains and beyond, and I would not leave thee to pine by the sluggish Zuro. But think not that delight and understanding dwell just across the Carthian hills, or in any spot thou canst find in a day's or a year's or a lustrum's journey. Behold, when I was small like thee, I dwelt in the valley of Narthos by the frigid Tsari, where none would listen to my dreams. And I told myself that when older I would go to Sinara on the southern slope and sing to smiling dromedary men in the marketplace. But when I went to Sinara, I found the dromedary men all drunken and ribald, and saw that their songs were not as mine. So I travelled in a barge down Tsari to onyx-walled Jarem, and the soldiers at Jaren laughed at me and drave me out, so that I wandered to many other cities. I have seen Stephilos, that is below the great cataract, and have gazed on the marsh where Sarnath once stood. I have been to Thra, Ilarnek, and Kadatheron on the winding river Ai, and have dwelt long in Alathoe, in the land of Lomar. But though I have had listeners sometimes, they have been ever few, and I know that welcome shall await me only in Ira, the city of marble and beryl, where my father once ruled as king. So, for Ira shall we seek, though it were well to visit distant and loot-blessed Unai across the Carthian hills, which may indeed be Ira, though I think not. Ira's beauty is past imagining, and none can tell of it without rapture, whilst of Unai the camel-drivers whisper leeringly. At the sunset, Iranon and small Romnod went forth from Teloth, and for long wandered amidst the green hills and cool forests. The way was rough and obscure, and never did they seem nearer to Unai, the city of lutes and dancing. But in the dusk, as the stars came out, Iranon would sing of Ira and its beauties, and Romnod would listen, so that they were both happy, after a fashion. They ate plentifully of fruit and red berries, and marked not the passing of time. But many years must have slipped away. Small Romnod was not now so small, and spoke deeply instead of shrilly, though Iranon was always the same, and decked his golden hair with vines and fragrant resins found in the woods. So it came to pass one day that Romnod seemed older than Iranon, though he had been very small when Iranon had found him, watching for green budding branches in Teloth, beside the sluggish stone-banked Zuro. Then, one night, when the moon was full, the travellers came to a mountain crest and looked down upon the myriad lights of Unai. Peasants had told them they were near, and Iranon knew that this was not his native city of Ira. The lights of Unai were not like those of Ira, for they were harsh and glaring, while the lights of Ira shine as softly and magically as shone the moonlight on the floor of the window where Iranon's mother once rocked him to sleep with song. But Unai was a city of lutes and dancing, so Iranon and Romnod went down the steep slope that they might find men to whom songs and dreams would bring pleasure. And when they were coming into the town, they found rose-wreathed revellers bound from house to house and leaning from windows and balconies, who listened to the songs of Iranon and tossed him flowers and applauded when he was done. Then, for a moment, did Iranon believe he had found those who thought and felt even as he, though the town was not 100th as fair as Ira. When came, Iranon looked about with dismay, for the domes of Unai were not golden in the sun, but grey and dismal, and the men of Unai were pale with revelling and dull with wine, and unlike the radiant men of Ira. But because the people had thrown him blossoms and acclaimed his songs, Iranon stayed on, and with him Romnod, who liked the revelry of the town and wore in his dark hair roses and myrtle. Often at night Iranon sang to the revellers, but he was always as before, crowned only with the vine of the mountains and remembering the marble streets of Ira and the hyaline Mithra. In the frescoed halls of the monarch did he sing, upon a crystal dais raised over a floor that was a mirror, and as he sang he brought pictures to his hearers till the floor seemed to reflect old, beautiful and half-remembered things, instead of the wine-reddened feasters who pelted him with roses. And the king bade him put away his tattered purple, and clothed him in satin and cloth of gold, with rings of green jade and bracelets of tinted ivory, and lodged him in a gilded and tapestried chamber on a bed of sweet carven wood with canopies and coverlets of flower-embroidered silk. Thus dwelt Iranon in Unai, the city of lutes and dancing. It is not known how long Iranon tarried in Unai, but one day the king brought to the palace some wild whirling dancers from the Iranian desert and dusky flute players from Drinen in the east. And after that, the revelers threw their roses not so much at Iranon as at the dancers and the flute players. And day by day, that Romnod, who had been a small boy in Granite Teloff, grew coarser and redder with wine, till he dreamed less and less, and listened with less delight to the songs of Iranon. But though Iranon was sad, he ceased not to sing, and at evening told again his dreams of Ira, the city of marble and beryl. Then, one night, the red and fattened Romnod snorted heavily amidst the poppied silks of his banquet couch, and died writhing, whilst Iranon, pale and slender, sang to himself in a far corner. And when Iranon had wept over the grave of Romnod, and strewn it with green budding branches, such as Romnod used to love, he put aside his silks and gauds, and went forgotten out of Unai, the city of lutes, and dancing, clad only in the ragged purple in which he had come, and garlanded with fresh vines from the mountains. Into the sunset wandered Iranon, seeking still for his native land, and for men who would understand and cherish his songs and dreams. In all the cities of Sidathria, and in the lands beyond the Manachik desert, gay-faced children laughed at his olden songs and tattered robe of purple. But Iranon stayed ever young, and wore wreaths upon his golden head, whilst he sang of Ira, delight of the past, and hope of the future. So came he one night to the squalid cot of an antique shepherd, bent and dirty, who kept lean flocks on a stony slope above a quicksand marsh. To this man Iranon spoke, as to so many others, "Canst thou tell me where I may find Ira, the city of marble and beryl, where flows the Hyaline Nithra, and where the falls of the tiny Kra sing to verdant valleys and hills forested with yacht trees?" And the shepherd, hearing, looked long and strangely at Iranon, as if recalling something very far away in time, and noted each line of the stranger's face, and his golden hair, and his crown of vine leaves. But he was old, and shook his head as he replied, "O stranger, I have indeed heard the name of Ira, and the other names thou hast spoken, but they come to me from afar down the waste of long years. I heard them in my youth from the lips of a playmate, a beggar's boy given to strange dreams, who would weave long tales about the moon and the flowers and the west wind. We used to laugh at him, for we knew him from his birth, though he thought himself a king's son. He was comely, even as thou, but full of folly and strangeness, and he ran away when small to find those who would listen gladly to his songs and dreams. How often hath he sung to me of lands that never were, and things that never can be. Of Ira did he speak much, of Ira and the river Nithra, and the falls of the tiny Kra. There would he ever say he once dwelt as a prince, though we here knew him from his birth. Nor was there ever a marble city of Ira, nor those who could delight in strange songs, save in the dreams of mine old playmate Iranon, who is gone. And in the twilight, as the stars came out one by one, and the moon cast on the marsh a radiance like that which a child sees quivering on the floor as he is rocked to sleep at evening, there walked into the lethal quicksands a very old man in tattered purple, crowned with withered vine leaves, and gazing ahead as if upon the golden domes of a fair city where dreams are understood. That night,
something of youth and beauty, died in the elder world. The Triumph of Night by Edith Wharton, published 1916. 1. It was clear that the sleigh from Waymore had not come, and the shivering young traveller from Boston, who had counted on jumping into it when he left the train at Northbridge Junction, found himself standing alone on the open platform, exposed to the full assault of nightfall and winter. The blast that swept him came off New Hampshire snowfields and ice-hung forests. It seemed to have traversed interminable leagues of frozen silence, filling them with the same cold roar and sharpening its edge against the same bitter black and white landscape. Dark, searching, and sword-like, it alternately muffled and harried its victim, like a bullfighter now whirling his cloak and now planting his darts. This analogy brought home to the young man the fact that he himself had no cloak, and that the overcoat in which he faced the relatively temperate air of Boston seemed no thicker than a sheet of paper on the bleak heights of Northridge. George Faxon said to himself that the place was uncommonly well named. It clung to an exposed ledge over the valley from which the train had lifted him, and the wind combed it with teeth of steel that he seemed actually to hear scraping against the wooden sides of the station. Other building there was none. The village lay far down the road, and thither, since the Waymore sleigh had not come, Faxon saw himself under the necessity of plodding through several feet of snow. He understood well enough what had happened. His hostess had forgotten that he was coming. Young as Faxon was, this sad lucidity of soul had been acquired as the result of long experience, and he knew that the visitors who can least afford to hire a carriage are almost always those whom their hosts forget to send it for. Yet to say that Mrs. Culm had forgotten him was too crude a way of putting it. A similar incident led him to think that she had probably told her maid to tell the butler, to telephone the coachman, tell one of the grooms, if no one else needed him, to drive over to Northridge to fetch the new secretary. But on a night like this, what groom who respected his rights would fail to forget the order? Faxon's obvious course was to struggle through the drifts to the village, and there rout out a sleigh to convey him to Waymore. But what if, on his arrival at Mrs. Culm's, no one remembered to ask him what this devotion to duty had cost? That, again, was one of the contingencies he had expensively learned to look out for, and the perspicacity so acquired told him it would be cheaper to spend the night at the Northridge Inn and advise Mrs. Culm of his presence there by telephone. He had reached this decision and was about to entrust his luggage to a vague man with a lantern when his hopes were raised by the sound of bells. 2 sleighs were just dashing up to the station, and from the foremost there sprang a young man muffled in furs. Waymore, no, these aren't the Waymore sleighs. The voice was that of the youth who had jumped to the platform, a voice so agreeable, in spite of the words, it fell consolingly on Faxon's ears. At the same moment, the wandering station lantern, casting a transient light on the speaker, showed his features to be in the pleasantest harmony with his voice. He was very fair and very young, hardly in his 20s, Faxon thought. But his face, though full of a morning freshness, was a trifle too thin and fine-drawn, as though a vivid spirit contended in him with a strain of physical weakness. Faxon was perhaps the quicker to notice such delicacies of balance, because his own temperament hung on lightly quivering nerves, which yet, as he believed, would never quite swing him beyond a normal sensibility. "You expected a sleigh from Waymore?" the newcomer continued, standing beside Faxon like a slender column of fur,
Mrs. Culm's secretary explained his difficulty, and the other brushed it aside with a contemptuous, "Oh, Mrs. Culm," that carried both speakers a long way toward reciprocal understanding. "But then you must be," the youth broke off with a smile of interrogation. "The new secretary, yes, but apparently there are no notes to be answered this evening." Faxon's laugh deepened the sense of solidarity which had so promptly established itself between the two. His friend laughed also. "Mrs. Culm," he explained, "was lunching at my uncle's today, and she said you were due this evening. But 7 hours is a long time for Mrs. Culm to remember anything." "Well," said Faxon philosophically, "I suppose that's one of the reasons why she needs a secretary. And I've always the inn at Northridge," he concluded. "Oh, but you haven't, though. It burned down last week." "The deuce it did," said Faxon, but the humour of the situation struck him before its inconvenience. His life, for years past, had been mainly a succession of resigned adaptations, and he had learned, before dealing practically with his embarrassments, to extract from most of them a small tribute of amusement. "Oh, well, there's sure to be somebody in the place who can put me up. No one you could put up with, and besides, Northridge is 3 miles off, and our place, in the opposite direction, is a little nearer." Through the darkness, Faxon saw his friend sketch a gesture of self-introduction. "My name's Frank Rayner, and I'm staying with my uncle at Overdale. I've driven over to meet 2 friends of his who are due in a few minutes from New York. If you don't mind waiting till they arrive, I'm sure Overdale can do you better than Northridge. We're only down from town for a few days, but the house is always ready for a lot of people." "But your uncle?" Faxon could only object, with the odd sense, through his embarrassment, that it would be magically dispelled by his invisible friend's next words. "Oh, my uncle, you'll see. I answer for him. I dare say you've heard of him? John Lavington?" John Lavington. There was a certain irony in asking if one had heard of John Lavington. Even from a post of observation as obscure as that of Mrs. Culm's secretary, the rumour of John Lavington's money, of his pictures, his politics, his charities, and his hospitality was as difficult to escape as the roar of a cataract in a mountain solitude. It might almost have been said that the one place in which one would not have expected to come upon him was in just such a solitude as now surrounded the speakers, at least in this deepest hour of its desertedness. But it was just like Lavington's brilliant ubiquity to put one in the wrong even there. "Oh, yes, I've heard of your uncle." "Then you will come, won't you? We've only 5 minutes to wait," young Rayner urged, in the tone that dispels scruples by ignoring them, and Faxon found himself accepting the invitation as simply as it was offered. The delay in the arrival of the New York train lengthened their 5 minutes to 15, and as they paced the icy platform, Faxon began to see why it had seemed the most natural thing in the world to accede to his new acquaintance's suggestion. It was because Frank Rayner was one of the privileged beings who simplify human intercourse by the atmosphere of confidence and good humour they diffuse. He produced this effect, Faxon noted, by the exercise of no gift but his youth, and of no art but his sincerity, and these qualities were revealed in a smile of such sweetness that Faxon felt, as never before, what nature can achieve when she deigns to match the face with the mind. He learned that the young man was the ward and the only nephew of John Lavington, with whom he had made his home since the death of his mother, the great man's sister. Mr. Lavington, Rayner said, had been a regular brick to him. But then he is to everyone, you know, and the young fellow's situation seemed in fact to be perfectly in keeping with his person. Apparently the only shade that had ever rested on him was cast by the physical weakness which Faxon had already detected. Young Rayner had been threatened with tuberculosis, and the disease was so far advanced that, according to the highest authorities, banishment to Arizona or New Mexico was inevitable. but luckily my uncle didn't pack me off, as most people would have done, without getting another opinion. Whose? Oh, an awfully clever chap, a young doctor with a lot of new ideas, who simply laughed at my being sent away and said I'd do perfectly well in New York if I didn't dine out too much, and if I dashed off occasionally to Northridge for a little fresh air. So it's really my uncle's doing that I'm not in exile, and I feel no end better since the new chap told me I needn't bother. Young Rayner went on to confess that he was extremely fond of dining out, dancing, and similar distractions, and Faxon, listening to him, was inclined to think that the physician who had refused to cut him off altogether from these pleasures was probably a better psychologist than his seniors. All the same, you ought to be careful, you know. The sense of elder brotherly concern that forced the words from Faxon made him, as he spoke, slip his arm through Frank Rayner's. The latter met the movement with a responsive pressure. Oh, I am. Awfully. And then my uncle has such an eye on me. But if your uncle has such an eye on you, what does he say to your swallowing knives out here in this Siberian wild? Rayner raised his fur collar with a careless gesture. It's not that does it. The code's good for me. And it's not the dinners and dances. What is it then? Faxon good-humouredly insisted, to which his companion answered with a laugh. Well, my uncle says it's being bored, and I rather think he's right. His laugh ended in a spasm of coughing and a struggle for breath that made Faxon, still holding his arm, guide him hastily into the shelter of the fireless waiting room. Young Rayner had dropped down on the bench against the wall and pulled off one of his fur gloves to grope for a handkerchief. He tossed aside his cap and drew the handkerchief across his forehead, which was intensely white and beaded with moisture, though his face retained a healthy glow. But Faxon's gaze remained fastened to the hand he had uncovered. It was so long, so colourless, so wasted, so much older than the brow he passed it over. It's queer, a healthy face, but dying hands, the secretary mused. He somehow wished young Rayner had kept on his glove. The whistle of the express drew the young men to their feet, and the next moment 2 heavily furred gentlemen had descended to the platform and were breasting the rigour of the night. Frank Rayner introduced them as Mr. Grisbin and Mr. Balch, and Faxon, while their luggage was being lifted into the second sleigh, discerned them by the roving lantern gleam to be an elderly grey-headed pair of the average prosperous business cut. They saluted their host's nephew with friendly familiarity, and Mr. Grisbin, who seemed the spokesman of the two, ended his greeting with a genial, "And many, many more of them, dear boy," which suggested to Faxon that their arrival coincided with an anniversary. But he couldn't press the inquiry, for the seat allotted to him was at the coachman's side, while Frank Rayner joined his uncle's guests inside the sleigh. A swift flight behind such horses as one could be sure of John Lavington's having brought them to tall gateposts, an illuminated lodge, and an avenue on which the snow had been levelled to the smoothness of marble. At the end of the avenue the long house loomed up, its principal bulk dark, but one wing sending out a ray of welcome, and the next moment Faxon was receiving a violent impression of warmth and light, of hothouse plants, hurrying servants, a vast spectacular oak hall like a stage setting, and in its unreal middle distance a small figure, correctly dressed, conventionally featured, and utterly unlike his rather florid conception of the great John Lavington. The surprise of the contrast remained with him through his hurried dressing in the large, luxurious bedroom to which he had been shown. "I don't see where he comes in," was the only way he could put it. So difficult was it to fit the exuberance of Lavington's public personality into his host's contracted frame and manner. Mr. Lavington, to whom Faxon's case had been rapidly explained by young Rayner, had welcomed him with a sort of dry and stilted cordiality that exactly matched his narrow face, his stiff hand, and the whiff of scent on his evening handkerchief. Make yourself at home, he'd repeated, in a tone that suggested, on his own part, a complete inability to perform the feat he urged on his visitor. Any friend of Frank's delighted, and make yourself thoroughly at home. 2. In spite of the balmy temperature and complicated conveniences of Faxon's bedroom, the injunction was not easy to obey. It was wonderful luck to have found a night's shelter under the opulent roof of Overdale, and he tasted the physical satisfaction to the full. But the place, for all its ingenuities of comfort, was oddly cold and unwelcoming. He couldn't have said why, and could only suppose that Mr. Lavington's intense personality, intensely negative but intense all the same, must in some occult way have penetrated every corner of his dwelling. Perhaps, though, it was merely that Faxon himself was tired and hungry, more deeply chilled than he had known till he came in from the cold, and unutterably sick of all strange houses and of the prospect of perpetually treading other people's stairs. "I hope you're not famished." Rayner's slim figure was in the doorway. "My uncle has a little business to attend to with Mr. Grisbin, and we won't dine for half an hour. Shall I fetch you, or can you find your way down? Come straight to the dining room, at the second door on the left of the long gallery." He disappeared, leaving a ray of warmth behind him, and Faxon, relieved, lit a cigarette and sat down by the fire. Looking about with less haste, he was struck by a detail that had escaped him. The room was full of flowers, a mere bachelor's room in the wing of a house opened only for a few days, in the dead middle of a New Hampshire winter. Flowers were everywhere, not in senseless profusion, but placed with the same conscious art that he had remarked in the grouping of the blossoming shrubs in the hall. A vase of arums stood on the writing table, a cluster of strange-hued carnations on the stand at his elbow, and from the bowls of glass and porcelain, clumps of freesia bulbs diffused their melting fragrance. The fact implied acres of glass, but that was the least interesting part of it. The flowers themselves, their quality, selection and arrangement, attested on someone's part, and on whose but John Lavington's, a solicitous and sensitive passion for that particular form of beauty. Well, it simply made the man, as he had appeared to Faxon, all the harder to understand. The half-hour elapsed, and Faxon, rejoicing at the prospect of food, set out to make his way to the dining room. He had not noticed the direction he had followed in going to his room, and was puzzled, when he left it, to find that 2 staircases of apparently equal importance invited him. He chose the one to his right, and reached at its foot a long gallery such as Rayner had described. The gallery was empty. The doors down its length were closed. But Rayner had said the second to the left, and Faxon, after pausing for some chance enlightenment which did not come, laid his hand on the second knob to the left. The room he entered was square, with dusky picture-hung walls. In its centre, about a table lit by veiled lamps, he fancied Mr. Lavington and his guests to be already seated at dinner. Then he perceived that the table was covered not with viands but with papers, and that he had blundered into what seemed to be his host's study. As he paused, Frank Rayner looked up. "Oh, here's Mr. Faxon. Why not ask him?" Mr. Lavington, from the end of the table, reflected his nephew's smile in a glance of impartial benevolence. "Certainly. Come in, Mr. Faxon, if you won't think it's a liberty." Mr. Grisbin, who sat opposite his host, turned his head toward the door. "Of course, Mr. Faxon's an American citizen?" Frank Rayner laughed. "That's all right. Oh, no, not one of your pin-pointed pens, Uncle Jack. Haven't you got a quill somewhere?" Mr. Bausch, who spoke slowly and as if reluctantly, in a muffled voice, of which there seemed to be very little left, raised his hand to say, "One moment, you acknowledge this to be—" "My last will and testament?"
Rayner's laugh redoubled. Well, I won't answer for the last. It's the first, anyway. It's a mere formula, Mr. Balch explained. Well, here goes. Rayner dipped his quill in the inkstand his uncle had pushed in his direction and dashed a gallant signature across the document. Faxon, understanding what was expected of him, and conjecturing that the young man was signing his will on the attainment of his majority, had placed himself behind Mr. Grisbin and stood awaiting his turn to affix his name to the instrument. Rayner, having signed, was about to push the paper across the table to Mr. Balch, but the latter, again raising his hand, said in his sad, imprisoned voice, "The seal." "Oh, does there have to be a seal?" Faxon, looking over to Mr. Grisbin at John Lavington, saw a faint frown between his impassive eyes. "Really, Frank?" He seemed, Faxon thought, slightly irritated by his nephew's frivolity. "Who's got a seal?" Frank Rayner continued, glancing about the table. "There doesn't seem to be one here." Mr. Grisbin interposed. "A wafer will do. Lavington, do you have a wafer?" Mr. Lavington had recovered his serenity. "There must be some in one of the drawers, but I'm ashamed to say I don't know where my secretary keeps these things. He ought to have seen to it that the wafer was sent with the document." "Oh, hang it." Frank Rayner pushed the paper aside. "It's the hand of God, and I'm as hungry as a wolf. Let's dine first, Uncle Jack." "I think I've a seal upstairs," said Faxon. Mr. Lavington sent him a barely perceptible smile. "So sorry to give you the trouble." "Oh, I say, don't send him after it now. Let's wait till after dinner." Mr. Lavington continued to smile on his guest, and the latter, as if under the faint coercion of the smile, turned from the room and ran upstairs. Having taken the seal from his writing case, he came down again and once more opened the door of the study. No one was speaking when he entered. They were evidently awaiting his return with the mute impatience of hunger, and he put the seal in Rayner's reach and stood watching while Mr. Grisbin struck a match and held it to one of the candles flanking the inkstand. As the wax descended on the paper, Faxon remarked again the strange emaciation, the premature physical weariness of the hand that held it. He wondered if Mr. Lavington had ever noticed his nephew's hand, and if it were not poignantly visible to him now. With this thought in his mind, Faxon raised his eyes to look at Mr. Lavington. The great man's gaze rested on Frank Rayner with an expression of untroubled benevolence, and at the same instant Faxon's attention was attracted by the presence in the room of another person who must have joined the group while he was upstairs searching for the seal. The newcomer was a man of about Mr. Lavington's age and figure, who stood just behind his chair, and who, at the moment when Faxon first saw him, was gazing at young Rayner with an equal intensity of attention. The likeness between the two men, perhaps increased by the fact that the hooded lamps on the table left the figure behind the chair in shadow, struck Faxon the more because of the contrast in their expression. John Lavington, during his nephew's clumsy attempt to drop the wax and apply the seal, continued to fasten on him a look of half-amused affection, while the man behind the chair, so oddly reduplicating the lines of his features and figure, turned on the boy a face of pale hostility. The impression was so startling that Faxon forgot what was going on about him. He was just dimly aware of young Rayner's exclaiming, "Your turn, Mr. Grisbin," and of Mr. Grisbin's protesting, "No, Mr. Faxon first," and of the pens being thereupon transferred to his own hand. He received it with a deadly sense of being unable to move, or even to understand what was expected of him, till he became conscious of Mr. Grisbin's paternally pointing out the precise spot on which he was to leave his autograph. The effort to fix his attention and steady his hand prolonged the process of signing, and when he stood up, a strange weight of fatigue on all his limbs, the figure behind Mr. Lavington's chair was gone.
Faxon felt an immediate sense of relief. It was puzzling that the man's exit should have been so rapid and noiseless. But the door behind Mr. Lavington was screened by a tapestry hanging, and Faxon concluded that the unknown looker-on had merely had to raise it to pass out. At any rate, he was gone, and with his withdrawal, the strange weight was lifted. Young Rayner was lighting a cigarette, Mr. Balch inscribing his name at the foot of the document. Mr. Lavington, his eyes no longer on his nephew, examining a strange white-winged orchid in the vase at his elbow. Everything suddenly seemed to have grown natural and simple again, and Faxon found himself responding with a smile to the affable gesture with which his host declared, "And now, Mr. Faxon, we'll dine." 3. I wondered how I blundered into the wrong room just now. "I thought you told me to take the second door on the left," Faxon said to Frank Rayner as they followed the older men down the gallery. "So I did, but I probably forgot to tell you which staircase to take. Coming from your bedroom, I ought to have said the fourth door to the right. It's a puzzling house, because my uncle keeps adding to it from year to year. He built this room last summer for his modern pictures." Young Rayner, pausing to open another door, touched an electric button, which sent a circle of light about the walls of a long room hung with canvases, the French Impressionist school. Faxon advanced, attracted by a shimmering Monet, but Rayner laid a hand on his arm. "He bought that last week, but come along, I'll show you all this after dinner. Or he will, rather. He loves it." "Does he really love things?" Rayner stared, clearly perplexed at the question. "Rather. Flowers and pictures especially. Haven't you noticed the flowers? I suppose you think his manner's cold. It seems so at first, but he's really awfully keen about things." Faxon looked quickly at the speaker. "Has your uncle a brother?" "Brother? No, never had. He and my mother were the only ones. Or any relation who looks like him, or who might be mistaken for him?" "Not that I ever heard of." "Does he remind you of someone?" "Yes." "That's queer. We'll ask him if he's got a double. Come on." But another picture had arrested Faxon, and some minutes elapsed before he and his young host reached the dining room. It was a large room with the same conventionally handsome furniture and delicately grouped flowers, and Faxon's first glance showed him that only 3 men were seated about the dining table. The man who had stood behind Mr. Lavington's chair was not present, and no seat awaited him. When the young men entered, Mr. Grisbin was speaking, and his host, who faced the door, sat looking down at his untouched soup plate and turning the spoon about in his small dry hand. "Pretty late to call them rumours. They were devilish close to facts when we left town this morning," Mr. Grisbin was saying, with an unexpected incisiveness of tone. Mr. Lavington laid down his spoon and smiled interrogatively. "Oh, facts. What are facts? Just the way a thing happens to look at a given minute." "You haven't heard anything from town," Mr. Grisbin persisted. "Not a syllable. So you see, Balch, a little more of that petite marmite. Mr. Faxon, between Frank and Mr. Grisbin, please." The dinner progressed through a series of complicated courses, ceremoniously dispensed by a prelatical butler attended by 3 tall footmen, and it was evident that Mr. Lavington took a certain satisfaction at the pageant. That, Faxon reflected, was probably the joint in his armour, that and the flowers. He had changed the subject, not abruptly, but firmly, when the young men entered, but Faxon perceived that it still possessed the thoughts of the 2 elderly visitors, and Mr. Balch presently observed in a voice that seemed to come from the last survivor down a mine shaft, "If it does come, it will be the biggest crash since '93. Mr. Lavington looked bored but polite. "Wall Street can stand crashes better than it could then. It's got a robuster constitution." "Yes, but..." "Speaking of constitution," Mr. Grisbin intervened, "Frank, are you taking care of yourself?" A flush rose to young Rayner's cheeks. "Why, of course, isn't that what I'm here for?" "You're here about 3 days in the month, aren't you?" and the rest of the time it's crowded restaurants and hot ballrooms in town. I thought you were to be shipped off to New Mexico. Oh, I've got a new man who says that's rot. Well, you don't look as if your new man were right, said Mr. Grisbin bluntly. Faxon saw the lad's colour fade and the rings of shadow deepen under his gay eyes. At the same moment, his uncle turned to him with a renewed intensity of attention. There was such solicitude in Mr. Lavington's gaze that it seemed almost to fling a shield between his nephew and Mr. Grisbin's tactless scrutiny. "We think Frank's a good deal better," he began. "This new doctor—" The butler, coming up, bent to whisper a word in his ear, and the communication caused a sudden change in Mr. Lavington's expression. His face was naturally so colourless that it seemed not so much to pale as to fade, to dwindle and recede into something blurred and blotted out. He half rose, sat down again, and sent a rigid smile about the table. "Will you excuse me? The telephone. Peters, go on with the dinner." With small, precise steps, he walked out of the door which one of the footmen had thrown open. A momentary silence fell on the group. Then Mr. Grisbin once more addressed himself to Rayner. "You ought to have gone, my boy. You ought to have gone." The anxious look returned to the youth's eyes. "My uncle doesn't think so, really." "You're not a baby to be always governed by your uncle's opinion. You came of age today, didn't you? Your uncle spoils you. That's what's the matter." The thrust evidently went home, for Rayner laughed and looked down with a slight accession of colour. "But the doctor—" "Use your common sense, Frank. You had to try 20 doctors to find one to tell you what you wanted to be told." A look of apprehension overshadowed Rayner's gaiety. "Oh, come, I say, what would you do?" he stammered. "Pack up and jump on the first train." Mr. Grisbin leaned forward and laid his hand kindly on the young man's arm. "Look here, my nephew Jim Grisbin is out there ranching on a big scale. He'll take you in and be glad to have you. You say your new doctor thinks it won't do you any good, but he doesn't pretend to say it will do you harm, does he? Well then, give it a trial. It'll take you out of hot theatres and night restaurants anyhow, and all the rest of it, eh, Bausch?" "Go," said Mr. Bausch hollowly. "Go, at once," he added, as if a closer look at the youth's face had impressed on him the need of backing up his friend. Young Rayner had turned ashy pale. He tried to stiffen his mouth into a smile. "Do I look as bad as all that?" Mr. Grisbin was helping himself to terrapin. "You look like the day after an earthquake," he said. The terrapin had encircled the table and been deliberately enjoyed by Mr. Lavington's 3 visitors. Rayner, the Faxon noted, left his plate untouched before the door was thrown open to readmit their host. Mr. Lavington advanced with an air of recovered composure. He seated himself, picked up his napkin and consulted the gold monogrammed menu. "No, don't bring back the fillet. Some terrapin, yes." He looked affably about the table. "Sorry to have deserted you, but the storm has played the deuce with the wires, and I had to wait a long time before I could get a good connection. It must be blowing up for a blizzard." "Uncle Jack," young Rayner broke out, "Mr. Grisbin's been lecturing me." Mr. Lavington was helping himself to terrapin. "Ah, what about?" "He thinks I ought to have given New Mexico a show. I want him to go straight out to my nephew at Santa Paz and stay there till his next birthday." Mr. Lavington signed to the butler to hand the terrapin to Mr. Grisbin, who, as he took a second helping, addressed himself again to Rayner. "Jim's in New York now, and going back the day after tomorrow in Oliphant's private car. I'll ask Oliphant to squeeze you in if you'll go. And when you've been out there a week or two, in the saddle all day and sleeping 9 hours a night, I suspect you won't think much of the doctor who prescribed New York." Faxon spoke up, he knew not why. "I was out there once. It's a splendid life. I saw a fellow, a really bad case, who'd been simply made over by it." "It does sound jolly," Rayner laughed, a sudden eagerness in his tone. His uncle looked at him gently. "Perhaps Grisbin's right. It's an opportunity." Faxon glanced up with a start. The figure, dimly perceived in the study, was now more visibly and tangibly planted behind Mr. Lavington's chair. "That's right, Frank. You see, your uncle approves. And a trip out there with Oliphant isn't a thing to be missed. So drop a few dozen dinners and be at the Grand Central the day after tomorrow at 5. Mr. Grisbin's pleasant grey eyes sought corroboration of his host, and Faxon, in a cold anguish of suspense, continued to watch him as he turned his glance on Mr. Lavington. One could not look at Lavington without seeing the presence at his back, and it was clear that the next minute some change in Mr. Grisbin's expression must give his watcher a clue. But Mr. Grisbin's expression did not change. The gaze he fixed on his host remained unperturbed, and the clue he gave was the startling one of not seeming to see the other figure. Faxon's first impulse was to look away, to look anywhere else, to resort again to the champagne glass the watchful butler had already brimmed. But some fatal attraction at war in him with an overwhelming physical resistance held his eyes upon the spot they feared. The figure was still standing, more distinctly, and therefore more resemblingly, at Mr. Lavington's back, and while the latter continued to gaze affectionately at his nephew, his counterpart, as before, fixed young Rayner with eyes of deadly menace. Faxon, with what felt like an actual wrench of the muscles, dragged his own eyes from the sight to scan the other countenances about the table, but not one revealed the least consciousness of what he saw, and a sense of mortal isolation sank upon him. "It's worth considering, certainly," he heard Mr. Lavington continue. And as Rayner's face lit up, the face behind his uncle's chair seemed to gather into its look all the fierce weariness of old, unsatisfied hates. That was the thing that, as the minutes laboured by, Faxon was becoming most conscious of. The watcher behind the chair was no longer merely malevolent. He had grown, suddenly, unutterably tired. His hatred seemed to well up out of the very depths of balked effort and thwarted hopes, and the fact made him more pitiable, and yet more dire. Faxon's look reverted to Mr. Lavington as if to surprise him in a corresponding change. At first, none was visible. His pinched smile was screwed to his blank face like a gaslight to a whitewashed wall. Then the fixity of the smile became ominous. Faxon saw that its wearer was afraid to let it go. It was evident that Mr. Lavington was unutterably tired too, and the discovery sent a colder current through Faxon's veins. Looking down at his untouched plate, he caught the soliciting twinkle of the champagne glass, but the sight of the wine turned him sick. "Well, we'll go into details presently," he heard Mr. Lavington say, still on the question of his nephew's future. "Let's have a cigar first. No, not here, Peters." He turned his smile on Faxon. "When we've had a coffee, I want to show you my pictures. Oh, by the way, Uncle Jack, Mr. Faxon wants to know if you've got a double." A double?" Mr. Lavington, still smiling, continued to address himself to his guest. "Not that I know of. Have you seen one, Mr. Faxon?" Faxon thought, "My God, if I look up now, they'll both be looking at me." To avoid raising his eyes, he made as though to lift the glass to his lips, but his hand sank inert, and he looked up. Mr. Lavington's glance was politely bent on him, but with a loosening of the strain about his heart, he saw that the figure behind the chair still kept its gaze on Rayner. "Do you think you've seen my double, Mr. Faxon?" Would the other face turn if he said yes? Faxon felt a dryness in his throat. "No," he answered. "Ah, it's possible I've a dozen. I believe I'm extremely usual looking," Mr. Lavington went on conversationally, and still the other face watched Rayner. It was a mistake, a confusion of memory, Faxon heard himself stammer. Mr. Lavington pushed back his chair, and as he did so, Mr. Grisbin suddenly leaned forward. "Lavington, what have we been thinking of? We haven't drunk Frank's health." Mr. Lavington reseated himself. "My dear boy, Peters, another bottle." He turned to his nephew. "After such a sin of omission, I don't presume to propose the toast myself, but Frank knows." "Go ahead, Grisbin." The boy shone on his uncle. No, Uncle Jack, Mr. Grisbin won't mind. Nobody but you today." The butler was replenishing the glasses. He filled Mr. Lavington's last, and Mr. Lavington put out his small hand to raise it. As he did so, Faxon looked away. "Well then, all the good I've wished you in all the past years, I put it into the prayer that the coming ones may be healthy and happy and many, dear boy." Faxon saw the hands about him reach out for their glasses. Automatically he reached for his. His eyes were still on the table, and he repeated to himself with a trembling vehemence, "I won't look up. I won't. I won't." His fingers clasped the glass and raised it to the level of his lips. He saw the other hands making the same motion. He heard Mr. Grisbin's genial "Hear, hear," and Mr. Batch's hollow echo. He said to himself as the rim of the glass touched his lips, "I won't look up, I swear I won't." And he looked. The glass was so full that it required an extraordinary effort to hold it there, brimming and suspended, during the awful interval before he could trust his hand to lower it again, untouched, to the table. It was this merciful preoccupation which saved him, kept him from crying out, from losing his hold, from slipping down into the bottomless blackness that gaped for him. As long as the problem of the glass engaged him, he felt able to keep his seat, manage his muscles, fit unnoticeably into the group. But as the glass touched the table, his last link with safety snapped. He stood up and dashed out of the room. 4. In the gallery, the instinct of self-preservation helped him to turn back and sign to young Rayner not to follow. He stammered out something about a touch of dizziness in joining them presently, and the boy nodded sympathetically and drew back. At the foot of the stairs, Faxon ran against the servant. "I should like to telephone to Waymore," he said with dry lips. "Sorry, sir, wire's all down. We've been trying for the last hour to get New York again for Mr. Lavington." Faxon shot onto his room, burst into it and bolted the door. The lamplight lay on furniture, flowers, books. In the ashes a log still glimmered. He dropped down on the sofa and hid his face. The room was profoundly silent. The whole house was still. Nothing about him gave a hint of what was going on, darkly and dumbly, in the room he had flown from. And with the covering of his eyes, oblivion and reassurance seemed to fall on him, but they fell for a moment only. Then his lids opened again to the monstrous vision. There it was, stamped on his pupils, a part of him forever, an indelible horror burnt into his body and brain. But why into his? Just his? Why had he alone been chosen to see what he had seen? What business was it of his, in God's name? Any one of the others thus enlightened might have exposed the horror and defeated it, but he, the one weaponless and defenseless spectator, the one whom none of the others would believe or understand if he attempted to reveal what he knew, he alone had been singled out as the victim of this dreadful initiation. Suddenly he sat up, listening. He had heard a step on the stairs. Someone, no doubt, was coming to see how he was, to urge him, if he felt better, to go down and join the smokers. Cautiously he opened his door. Yes, it was young Rayner's step. Vaxon looked down the passage, remembered the other stairway, and darted to it. All he wanted was to get out of the house. Not another instant would he breathe its abominable air. What business was it of his, in God's name? He reached the opposite end of the lower gallery, and beyond it saw the hall by which he had entered. It was empty, and on a long table he recognized his coat and cap. He got into his coat, unbolted the door, and plunged into the purifying night. The darkness was deep, and the cold so intense that for an instant it stopped his breathing. Then he perceived that only a thin snow was falling, and resolutely he set his face for flight. The trees along the avenue marked his way as he hastened with long strides over the beaten snow. Gradually, while he walked, the tumult in his brain subsided. The impulse to fly still drove him forward, but he began to feel that he was flying from the terror of his own creating, and that the most urgent reason for escape was the need of hiding his state, of shunning other eyes till he should regain his balance. Mrs. Culm's forgetfulness, to confess it had cost a pang. That was what his rootless life had brought him to. For lack of a personal stake in things, his sensibility was at the mercy of such trifles. Yes, that, and the cold and fatigue, the absence of hope and the haunting sense of starved aptitudes. All these had brought him to the perilous verge over which, once or twice before, his terrified brain had hung. Why else, in the name of any imaginable logic, human or devilish, should he, a stranger, be singled out for this experience? What could it mean to him? How was he related to it? What bearing had it on his case? Unless, indeed, it was just because he was a stranger everywhere, because he had no personal life, no warm screen of private egotisms to shield him from exposure, that he had developed this abnormal sensitiveness to the vicissitudes of others. What pulled him up with a shudder? No, such a fate was too abominable. All that was strong and sound in him rejected it. 1,000 times better regard himself as ill, disorganized, deluded, than as the predestined victim of such warnings. He reached the gates and paused before the darkened lodge. The wind had risen and was sweeping the snow into his face. The cold had him in its grasp again, and he stood uncertain. Should he put his sanity to the test and go back? He turned and looked down the dark drive to the house. A single ray shone through the trees, evoking a picture of the lights, the flowers, the faces grouped about that fatal room. He turned and plunged out into the road. He remembered that about a mile from Overdale, the coachman had pointed out the road to Northridge, and he began to walk in that direction. Once in the road, he had the gale in his face, and the wet snow on his moustache and eyelashes instantly hardened to ice. The same ice seemed to be driving a million blades into his throat and lungs, but he pushed on, the vision of the warm room pursuing him. The snow in the road was deep and uneven. He stumbled across ruts and sank into drift, and the wind drove against him like a granite cliff. Now and then he stopped, gasping, as if an invisible hand had tightened an iron band about his body. Then he started again, stiffening himself against the stealthy penetration of the cold. The snow continued to descend out of a pall of inscrutable darkness, and once or twice he paused, fearing he had missed the road to Northridge, but seeing no sign of a turn, he ploughed on. At last, feeling sure that he had walked for more than a mile, he halted and looked back. The act of turning brought immediate relief, first because it put the wind to his back, and then because, far down the road, it showed him the gleam of a lantern. A sleigh was coming, a sleigh that might perhaps give him a lift to the village. Fortified by the hope, he began to walk back toward the light. It came very slowly, with unaccountable zigzags and waverings, and even when he was within a few yards of it, he could catch no sound of sleigh bells. Then it paused and became stationary by the roadside, as though carried by a pedestrian who had stopped, exhausted by the cold. The thought made Faxon hasten on, and a moment later he was stooping over a motionless figure huddled against the snowbank. The lantern had dropped from its bearer's hand, and Faxon, fearfully raising it, threw its light into the face of Frank Rayner. "Rayner, what on earth are you doing here?" The boy smiled back through his pallor. "What are you, I'd like to know," he retorted, and scrambling to his feet with a clutch on Faxon's arm, he added gaily, "Well, I've run you down." Faxon stood, confounded, his heart sinking. The lad's face was grey. "What madness," he began. "Yes, it is. What on earth did you do it for?" "I? Do what? Why, I was just taking a walk. I often walk at night." Frank Rayner burst into a laugh. "On such nights? Then you hadn't bolted?" "Bolted? Because I'd done something to offend you. My uncle thought you had." Faxon grasped his arm. "Did your uncle send you after me?" "Well, he gave me an awful rowing for not going up to your room when you said you were ill. And when we found you'd gone, we were frightened, and he was awfully upset. So I said I'd catch you." "You're not ill, are you?" "Ill? No, never better." Faxon picked up the lantern. "Come, let's go back. It was awfully hot in that dining room." "Yes, I hoped it was only that." They trudged on in silence for a few minutes, then Faxon questioned, "You're not too done up?" Oh no, it's a lot easier walking with the wind behind us." "All right, don't talk anymore." They pushed on ahead, walking in spite of the light that guided them, more slowly than Faxon had walked alone into the gale. The fact of his companions stumbling against a drift gave Faxon a pretext for saying, "Take hold of my arm," and Rayner, obeying, gasped out, "I'm blown." "So am I. Who wouldn't be?" "What a dance you led me. If it hadn't been for one of the servants happening to see you." "Yes, all right, and now, won't you kindly shut up?" Rayner laughed and hung on him. "Oh, the cold doesn't hurt me." For the first few minutes after Rayner had overtaken him, anxiety for the lad had been Faxon's only thought, but as each labouring step carried them nearer to the spot he had been fleeing, the reasons for his flight grew more ominous and more insistent. No, he was not ill. He was not distraught and deluded. He was the instrument singled out to warn and save, and here he was, irresistibly driven, dragging the victim back to his doom. The intensity of the conviction had almost checked his steps, but what could he do or say? At all costs he must get Rayner out of the cold, into the house and into his bed. After that he would act. The snowfall was thickening, and as they reached the stretch of the road between open fields, the wind took them at an angle, lashing their faces with barbed thongs. Rayner stopped to take breath, and Faxon felt the heavier pressure of his arm. "When we get to the lodge, can't we telephone to the stable for a sleigh?" "If they're not all asleep at the lodge." "Oh, I'll manage. Don't talk," Faxon ordered, and they plodded on. At length the lantern ray showed ruts that curved away from the road under tree darkness. Faxon's spirits rose. "There's the gate. We'll be there in 5 minutes." As he spoke, he caught above the boundary hedge the gleam of a light at the farther end of the dark avenue. It was the same light that had shone on the scene of which every detail was burnt into his brain, and he felt again its overpowering reality. No, he couldn't let the boy go back. They were at the lodge at last, and Faxon was hammering on the door. He said to himself, "I'll get him inside first and make them give him a hot drink, then I'll find an argument." There was no answer to his knocking, and after an interval Rayner said, "Look here, we'd better go on." "No, I can, perfectly." You shan't go to the house, I say." Faxon redoubled his blows, and at length steps sounded on the stairs. Rayner was leaning against the lintel, and as the door opened, the light from the hall flashed on his pale face and fixed eyes. Faxon caught him by the arm and drew him in. "It was cold out there," he sighed, and then abruptly, as if invisible shears at a single stroke had cut every muscle in his body, he swerved, drooped on Faxon's arms, and seemed to sink into nothing at his feet. The lodgekeeper and Faxon bent over him, and somehow, between them, lifted him into the kitchen and laid him on a sofa by the stove. The lodgekeeper, stammering, "I'll ring up the house," dashed out of the room, but Faxon heard the words without heeding them. Omens mattered nothing now beside this woe fulfilled. He knelt down to undo the fur collar about Rayner's throat, and as he did so he felt a warm moisture on his hands. He held them up, and they were red. 5. The palms threaded their endless line along the yellow river. The little steamer lay at the wharf, and George Faxon, sitting in the veranda of the wooden hotel, idly watched the coolies carrying the freight across the gangplank. He had been looking at such scenes for 2 months. Nearly 5 had elapsed since he had descended from the train at Northridge and strained his eyes for the sleigh that was to take him to Waymore, which he was never to behold. Part of the interval, the first part, was still a great grey blur. Even now he could not be quite sure how he had got back to Boston, reached the house of a cousin, and been thence transferred to a quiet room looking out on snow under bare trees. He looked out for a long time at the same scene, and finally one day a man he had known at Harvard came to see him and invited him to go out on a business trip to the Malay Peninsula. "You've had a bad shake-up, and it'll do you no end of good to get away from things." When the doctor came the next day, it turned out that he knew of the plan and approved it. "You ought to be quiet for a year, just loaf and look at the landscape," he advised. Faxon felt the first stirrings of curiosity. "What's been the matter with me, anyway?" "Well, overwork, I suppose. You must have been bottling up for a bad breakdown before you started for New Hampshire last December, and the shock of that poor boy's death did the rest." Ah, yes, Rayner had died, he remembered. He started for the east, and gradually, by imperceptible degrees, life crept back into his weary bones and leaden brain. His friend was patient and considerate, and they travelled slowly and talked little. At first, Faxon had felt a great shrinking from whatever touched on familiar things. He seldom looked at a newspaper, and he never opened a letter without a contraction of the heart. It was not that he had any special cause for apprehension, but merely that a great trail of darkness lay on everything. He had looked too deep down into the abyss. But little by little health and energy returned to him, and with them the common promptings of curiosity. He was beginning to wonder how the world was going, and when presently the hotel keeper told him there were no letters for him in the steamer's mailbag, he felt a distinct sense of disappointment. His friend had gone into the jungle on a long excursion, and he was lonely, unoccupied, and wholesomely bored. He got up and strolled into the stuffy reading room. There he found a game of dominoes, a mutilated picture puzzle, some copies of Zion's Herald, and a pile of New York and London newspapers. He began to glance through the papers, and was disappointed to find that they were less recent than he had hoped. Evidently the last numbers had been carried off by luckier travellers. He continued to turn them over, picking out the American ones first. These, as it happened, were the oldest. They dated back to December and January. To Faxon, however, they had all the flavour of novelty, since they covered the precise period during which he had virtually ceased to exist. It had never before occurred to him to wonder what had happened in the world during that interval of obliteration, but now he felt a sudden desire to know. To prolong the pleasure, he began by sorting the papers chronologically, and as he found and spread out the earliest number, the date at the top of the page entered into his consciousness like a key slipping into a lock. It was the 17th of December, the date of the day after his arrival at Northridge. He glanced at the first page and read in blazing characters, "Reported failure of Opal Cement Company. Lavington's name involved. Gigantic exposure of corruption shakes Wall Street to its foundations." He read on, and when he had finished the first paper, he turned to the next, where there was a gap of 3 days, but the Opal Cement investigation still held the center of the stage. From its complex revelations of greed and ruin, his eyes wandered to the death notices, and he read, "Rayner, suddenly at Northridge, New Hampshire. Francis John, only son of the late." His eyes clouded, and he dropped the newspaper and sat for a long time with his face in his hands. When he looked up again, he noticed that his gesture had pushed the other papers from the table and scattered them at his feet. The uppermost lay spread out before him, and heavily his eyes began their search again. "John Lavington comes forward with plan for reconstructing company, offers to put in 10 millions of his own, the proposal under consideration by the district attorney." 10 millions. 10 millions of his own. But if John Lavington was ruined... Faxon stood up with a cry. That was it then. That was what the warning meant. And if he had not fled from it, dashed wildly away from it into the night, he might have broken the spell of iniquity. The powers of darkness might not have prevailed. He caught up the pile of newspapers and began to glance through each in turn for the headline, "Wills admitted to probate." In the last of all, he found the paragraph he sought, and it stared up at him as if with Rayner's dying eyes. That was what he had done. The powers of pity had singled him out to warn and save, and he had closed his ears to their call and washed his hands of it and fled. Washed his hands of it. That was the word. It caught him back to the dreadful moment in the lodge when, raising himself up from Rayner's side, he had looked at his hands and seen that they were red.